On the 28th of May 2013, a 28-year-old man wearing a rubber horse head mask jumped into a powerful, churning whirlpool to film a video for his YouTube channel. His friend filmed from the harbor wall above, laughing as the man in the mask made neighing sounds and swirled around in the vortex. But then, the man decided he wanted a more dramatic shot. He took his camera, dove beneath the surface to film the whirlpool from below, and he vanished. And what happened in the next few minutes would reveal the terrifying, hidden power of the water he loved so much. Okay, let's get into today's story. Jacob Cockle had always loved the water. It was just in his blood. He grew up in a coastal town called Penzance in the United Kingdom, and from the moment he could walk, he was drawn to the ocean. He spent pretty much all of his time surfing at one of the local beaches. By the time he was just 10 years old, he was already so obsessed that he started skipping school to go catch waves. Naturally, this got him into a whole lot of trouble with his parents and his teachers. They just couldn't understand why he would throw away his education for the ocean. But through all the arguments and the frustrations, there was always one person who completely understood him, one person who always had his back. And that was his older sister, Grace. Jacob and Grace were incredibly close. They were more than just siblings. They were best friends. They even developed their own special secret language that they would use to talk to each other. Jacob used it so often, in fact, that some people who overheard him actually thought he had a speech problem. But it was just their private world, a bond that no one else could break. When Jacob was 17, his world was shattered. Grace was diagnosed with a brain tumor. It was aggressive and fast-moving, and she passed away very quickly after the diagnosis. This loss had a profound and irreversible impact on Jacob. It was like his entire view of the world had shifted overnight. He started to believe something very personal and powerful, that Grace's energy, her spirit, hadn't just disappeared. He felt it had been transferred directly to him. He came to believe that it was now his solemn duty to live for both of them, to experience everything the world had to offer for himself and for his sister. This new belief translated into a new way of living. Jacob began taking more and more risks. He felt like he couldn't pass up any opportunity, no matter how dangerous. He wanted to live life to its absolute fullest, even if that meant being a little bit reckless. Alongside his love for the water, Jacob also had a deep passion for photography. And so, he combined these two loves with his new risk-taking attitude. He started performing incredible water-based stunts and filming himself while he did them. He would go surfing in the middle of violent storms, paddling out into waves that would send most experienced surfers running for the shore. He would leap off of tall buildings into water that was alarmingly shallow. He would go free diving to dangerous depths, holding his breath for minutes at a time just to capture the perfect shot. And Jacob absolutely loved it. He loved the adrenaline, he loved the challenge, and he loved capturing these heart-stopping moments on film. He decided this was what he was meant to do. This was going to be his career. He was going to become a world-famous photographer who specialized in capturing the most dangerous and beautiful images the ocean had to offer. To keep himself focused, Jacob got a huge piece of paper and taped it to his bedroom wall. In big, bold black marker, he wrote himself a reminder, a mantra. I will become a world-famous photographer, and I will let nothing stand in my way. He meant it literally. He was prepared to go to any length, to face any danger, to get the shots he needed to build his career and honor his sister's memory. And this intense, unwavering attitude actually worked. By his early 20s, Jacob was already making a name for himself. He had won major photography awards from prestigious organizations like National Geographic and the Sunday Times. He became a regular contributor to major surf magazines, and his photos almost always landed on the cover. Most of his award-winning pictures were of the sea in its most violent and turbulent forms. He had an eye for capturing the raw power of nature. One of his most famous shots was of a fishing boat struggling to get back into port through a massive swell during a storm. That photo won a competition that led to it being displayed all over the London Underground, seen by millions of people. Another incredible shot he took was off the coast of Sumatra, way out in the middle of the open ocean. Jacob and his friend were in the water, right in front of a massive supertanker that was bearing down on them. His friend was surfing the huge wake created by the ship. It was an unbelievably dangerous picture to take, but it won him an award run by the Guardian newspaper. Jacob wasn't interested in the money for its own sake. Any money he earned from these competitions, he immediately spent on better photography equipment. If he was ever given a physical prize like a brand new television, he would just give it away to one of his friends. All he cared about was getting back out there, living life on the edge, taking crazy chances, and capturing those experiences on film. There was one particular crazy experience that he had always wanted to capture on film, and it happened right in his own hometown of Penzance. A few times a year, a very strong and very distinct whirlpool would appear in a harbor right near his childhood home. The whirlpool wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a quirk of engineering. It was designed to keep the harbor from silting up with sand and sediment. At high tide, water would rush into the harbor and hit a large concrete structure called a quay wall. At the bottom of this wall was a large tunnel that fed into another, separate pool of water on the other side. So, as the tide came in, this secondary pool would fill up with water. Then, when the tide started to go out during low tide, the water in the main harbor would drain away, and the water from the filled-up pool would slowly filter back out through that same tunnel. This outflow of water was designed to push all the silt and sand out of the harbor, keeping it deep enough for boats. But sometimes, especially during very high tides, the water would come into the harbor so quickly that it would build up against the quay wall much faster than it could drain through the tunnel into the pool. When this happened, it created the same effect you see in your bathtub when you pull the plug. As all that excess water was forced down and sucked through the narrow tunnel, it would create a huge, powerful whirlpool that you could see spinning on the surface right next to the quay wall. This whirlpool only formed a couple of times a year, but it was incredibly dangerous. There were caution signs posted all around the edge of the harbor and on the quay wall itself, warning people to stay out of the water. But in his mid-20s, Jacob started ignoring those signs. Every time the whirlpool formed, he started jumping into it. He found that if he was careful, he could swirl around the outside edge of the vortex. He would film it from inside and just on the surface. He would upload these videos to YouTube, and they went viral, getting millions and millions of views. The footage was breathtakingly beautiful and absolutely terrifying at the same time. On the 28th of May, 2013, Jacob was 28 years old. He noticed that the whirlpool was back in his hometown harbor, and he knew he had to go out and film it again. He ran over to his friend David's house and asked him to come down to the harbor and film him from the quay wall while he was inside the whirlpool. By the time David gathered his things and made his way down to the harbor, he looked over the edge of the wall and saw that Jacob was already in the water, swirling around in the vortex. David also noticed something strange. Jacob was wearing a rubber horsehead mask. When David asked him why, Jacob yelled up that it would be more eye-catching on YouTube, that it would help the video get more views. So David leaned over the wall and started filming as Jacob, in his horse mask, swirled around and around in the whirlpool, making neighing sounds for the camera. After a few minutes of this, Jacob stopped and tried to swim away from the whirlpool. But you could see just how strong the pull of the water was. Even with swimming flippers on his feet, Jacob really struggled to get away from the vortex. He was in good spirits about it, though. He was laughing and talking to David, saying how, when he first jumped in, this particular whirlpool was actually pretty scary. He told David it was definitely the strongest one he had ever been in at that spot. David agreed, yelling down, "Yeah, I can tell from up here, that one's really strong." For the next 10 to 15 minutes, David and Jacob joked back and forth about the whirlpool's strength. Jacob would put his horse mask back on, swirl around inside the vortex for a bit, then swim out again. Towards the end of the video David was filming, Jacob yelled up that he had one more thing in mind that he wanted to do. He wanted to dive down below the surface and film the whirlpool from underneath. He asked David to hand his camera down to him. David handed it down. You can see on the video Jacob adjusting the settings on his camera, and then he took a deep breath and dove below the surface to begin filming the underwater vortex. David, up on the quay wall, was watching him. He was very familiar with the kinds of things Jacob did. He knew Jacob was an incredible swimmer and had a great ability to hold his breath for a long time. But after a couple of minutes passed and Jacob still hadn't re-emerged, David started to get scared. He started yelling his name. When Jacob still didn't come up, David panicked. He turned and ran to the other side of the quay wall, the side that looked down into the secondary pool. He looked over the railing and he could see the water still rushing into the pool from the tunnel, but there was no sign of Jacob. He ran back and forth a couple of times, scanning the water on both sides of the wall. He couldn't see Jacob anywhere. Finally, he went back to the poolside one more time and looked down. And that's when he saw him. Jacob was down below, lying face down in the water, motionless. David scrambled down and waded out to him, but it was already too late. Jacob had drowned. The reason Jacob was always able to swirl around at the top of the whirlpool without getting pulled under was because he was wearing a wetsuit. Wetsuits are naturally buoyant. They help you float. But as you go deeper underwater, the water pressure increases and pushes against your wetsuit. This compression reduces the overall buoyancy of the suit. So, when Jacob dove down into this extremely powerful whirlpool, the immense pressure of the water pushed against his suit, and he lost his buoyancy. He was no longer floating. At that point, he got caught up in the powerful current of the whirlpool, and he was slowly but surely pulled down towards the bottom. He probably fought as hard as he could, trying to swim back to the surface, but the force was too great. Eventually, he was forced into the opening of that tunnel underneath the quay wall. He was trapped under there until he ran out of air and drowned. His body was then eventually spit out of the tunnel on the other side, into the pool where his friend David found him. From a very young age, Carrie O'Connor had an intense and passionate love of learning. When she first learned how to read, her parents had to practically bribe her just to get her to put her book down so she would go outside and play with the other kids. While Carrie loved to learn about everything, her absolute favorite subject was French culture. She began devouring all things French, the history, the art, the food. In middle school, she began studying the language, and by the time she was in high school, she was nearly fluent and was already taking college-level French courses. Carrie's passion never wavered. She would go on to earn several degrees in French, culminating in a PhD, and in 2019, she was finally able to put that PhD to its intended use, when she was offered a full-time professorship at Boston University. She was thrilled and eagerly accepted the role. After her first full year teaching at BU, she decided it was time to get an apartment that was closer to the campus. So, in August of 2020, shortly after her 38th birthday, Carrie, along with her two beloved cats, moved into an old apartment building on a busy street, just a 10-minute walk from Boston University. Even with her new apartment, still filled with unopened moving boxes and furniture still wrapped in plastic, Carrie's first priority was her students. She sat down at her laptop and enthusiastically wrote an email to all of her students for the upcoming year. The subject line was "The Joy of Learning French." In the email, her students could immediately see her incredible passion for the French language and just how excited she was about the new academic year. A few weeks later, on Monday, September 14th, Carrie was back at her apartment building after a day of classes. She had just purchased a brand new piece of furniture, and she was trying to get it up to her apartment. This piece of furniture wasn't assembled yet. All the parts and the instructions were inside a single large box. This box was 7 feet tall, about a foot wide, and weighed just under 80 pounds. So it was both heavy and incredibly awkward to handle. Carrie managed to get this huge box out of her car at street level and then hauled it all the way through the front doors of her apartment building and into the first floor lobby. She leaned the box up against the wall and then pressed the call button for the elevator. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to have a basic understanding of how the elevator in Carrie's old building worked. It was an older model. Once the elevator car arrived at your floor, you would have to manually slide open a big heavy door called the hoistway door. On the other side of that, you would see the elevator car itself, and on the car, there was yet another door. This one was called the car gate. It was a metal accordion-style gate that you also had to slide to the side by hand. But unlike the outer hoistway door, this inner car gate had a critical safety feature. It had to be shut all the way in order for the elevator to be able to move between floors. So, when the light dinged in the first floor lobby, signaling the elevator's arrival, Carrie opened up the heavy hoistway door. Then she reached inside and slid open the metal car gate. After that, she grabbed her huge package and began the difficult process of trying to push it inside the elevator car. It was immediately clear that the only way this 7-foot-tall box was going to fit inside the small elevator was if she got it in there at an angle, standing upright. But no matter how hard she pushed and pulled and twisted it, she just could not get the box to go inside. While Carrie was struggling with this, another tenant happened to walk in through the front doors of the apartment building. He saw Carrie struggling with the box. At first, he just walked past her and started heading up the stairs towards his own apartment. But then he stopped, turned around, and said to Carrie, "Hey, I don't think it's a good idea to keep doing what you're doing. That package looks like it's too heavy for that elevator." He explained that the elevator was really old and that they had had problems with it before. He warned her that she might trip a sensor and the elevator might start moving before she was ready. He told her it just wasn't worth the risk. Carrie, who was already pretty committed to getting this done, hesitated for a second. She looked at her package, then looked back up at the man and said, "You know what? I'm just going to try one more time to get it inside the elevator." Seeing her determination, the other tenant hesitated for a moment and then decided to help her. He went back down the stairs and held open the heavy hoistway door with his hand. Carrie then stepped inside the elevator car and used her own hip to keep the inner car gate from closing. Working together, the two of them began pushing and pulling, and finally, after a lot of effort, they were able to wedge the package at an angle inside the elevator car. Carrie thanked the man for his help, and he said, "No problem." Then he turned and walked up the stairs and disappeared from view. Once he was gone, Carrie didn't press any of the floor buttons. Instead, she tried to close the inner car gate over the top of her package. But at the same time, down in the basement, a maintenance worker hit the call button for the elevator. Unbeknownst to Carrie, when she and the other tenant had wedged her huge package inside the elevator, the very top of the box had pressed up against a safety sensor at the top of the door frame. This sensor was the one that registered when the car gate was fully shut. So, when the maintenance worker in the basement pressed the call button, the elevator's system was tricked. Because the package was pressing on that sensor, the elevator thought the inner gate was shut and secured, and that it was time to move. And so, the car began to descend towards the basement. But it only made it a couple of feet before the movement caused the package to slip off of the sensor. The moment the box was no longer pressing on the sensor, the elevator's safety system kicked in and the car stopped abruptly. Carrie was most likely very confused about how the car could have moved at all, considering the inner car gate was still wide open. But she had bigger problems now. She was trapped in the elevator, stuck between the first floor lobby and the basement. She didn't panic, though. She decided she would just try to get her package fully back inside the elevator car, and then she would figure out what to do next. When the package had slipped off the sensor, it had fallen forward and was now jutting out of the elevator. The top half of the box was in the first floor lobby, propped up against the floor. So Carrie turned around so her back was facing the opening of the elevator. She got down into a squatting position underneath her package, put her shoulder up against it, and then began pressing it upwards as hard as she could. She managed to press the package back up and inside of the car, but once again, the top of that package made contact with that same sensor that registers whether the gate is shut. And so, believing it was shut and secure, the elevator began moving down again. This time, Carrie, whose back was to the opening of the elevator, lost her balance. She fell backwards out of the moving elevator and into the narrow, dark space between the outside of the elevator car and the inside of the elevator shaft wall. Now, if the elevator had not been moving, she probably could have just crawled back up into the elevator, but unfortunately, her package did not slip off the sensor this time. It stayed firmly pressed against it. And so, the elevator still believed the gate was shut, and it kept on moving down towards the basement. As soon as Carrie fell into this narrow space, the downward movement of the elevator would have pulled her into that space, crushing her up against the inside of the elevator shaft wall as the heavy car forced its way down past her. But the car didn't even make it all the way to the basement. It stopped once Carrie's body was pinned perfectly between the elevator car and the elevator shaft walls. When the fire department finally arrived, it was far too late. Carrie was already deceased. On Thanksgiving morning in the year 1900, and one 8-year-old named Thomas Pedler told his mother that he was just going out for a little bit, but that he would definitely be back in time for the turkey dinner that afternoon. Then he grabbed his jacket and his coat and headed out the door. Thomas lived in a very working-class neighborhood in San Francisco, California. It was the kind of place where, generally speaking, nothing big or exciting ever really happened. It was a neighborhood where people just worked hard, and that was about it. But on this particular day, something huge was happening in Thomas's neighborhood. The big annual football game between Stanford University and the University of California was taking place at the stadium right in Thomas's district. They were expecting over 20,000 people to cram into that stadium. Thomas was not about to miss this incredible spectacle, even though he didn't have enough money to buy a ticket. He was determined that he would find a way to watch this game. So, Thomas left his house and ran to the stadium, which was not far from where he lived. He waited in front of the main gate where all these people were streaming in to get into the stadium. Around 11:00 in the morning, Thomas's very close friend, Charles, who was also a young man, made his way to the front gate. The two met up, and at first, their plan was to try to sneak in with the huge horde of people that were making their way into the stadium. But even though they were still hours away from the opening kickoff of the big game, which was at 2:30 the afternoon, the stadium was already completely packed. There was literally nowhere to sit, and there was nowhere to stand. Even people who had tickets and were going in were looking around, wondering where on earth they were going to watch the game from. So, Thomas and Charles realized, what's the point of sneaking in if there's nowhere to even see the field? They decided they needed to find another way to watch this game. They began looking around the outside of the stadium, and they noticed there was a huge fence that lined the entire perimeter of the stadium. They saw that some people had already climbed up onto this fence, trying to get a view down onto the field. Thomas and Charles decided they would try to do that too, but they quickly saw that all the good spots on the fence were already taken. The few spots that were still open provided absolutely no view of the field. So that option didn't work either. Thomas and Charles were getting frustrated. They were starting to worry that they were going to miss the big game entirely. But as they walked back over to the front gates of the stadium, they happened to notice a group of people across the street. This group was rushing over to a big white brick factory building. They were literally placing ladders up against the sides of this building and beginning to climb up it. This was a 5-story building, and people were just free climbing the windows and the fire escapes to get to the top. Thomas and Charles realized that the roof of this factory was flat, and that it provided a perfect, unobstructed view down onto the football field. All of these people were trying to get a good seat to watch the game. Without any hesitation, Thomas and Charles decided they were going to do the same thing. They left the stadium, ran across the street, and began climbing up the ladders, scrambling up the windows and the fire escapes, until, finally, they made it onto the roof, 55 feet off the ground. When they got up there weren't that many people yet, so Thomas and Charles were able to run right over to the front edge of the building and claim a spot with an absolutely perfect view of the game. A couple of hours later, at 2:30 the afternoon, when the game actually started, the rooftop that Thomas and Charles were on was now completely packed with people. Hundreds of people had climbed up onto this factory. There had been some factory workers down below, telling people not to do this, yelling that it wasn't safe to climb on top of the factory, but nobody listened to them. And the police either didn't notice what was happening, or they just didn't care. So, there were all these people on this roof, they were all super excited, and the game had finally begun. As soon as the game started, the crowd inside the stadium, which could be heard very easily from the rooftop, just erupted. There were bands playing in the stadium, and the sound was incredible. It was chaos down below, and that chaotic energy really caught on up on the roof. All the men, including Thomas and Charles, were getting amped up about the game. They were singing, they were chanting, they were screaming, they were yelling. It was total chaos, and Thomas and Charles loved every second of it. But about 20 minutes into the game, as Thomas and Charles were enjoying themselves and the crowd was still going wild, a dull cracking sound could be heard coming from one side of the roof. Thomas and Charles kind of spun around to see where this cracking sound had come from. When they began looking out across the sea of people on the roof, they noticed that on the far side of the roof where the sound seemed to have come from, people were scrambling, trying to get off the roof. But before Thomas and Charles and the other people around them who were watching this happen could figure out what was going on, there was a much louder cracking sound. And suddenly, the floor underneath Thomas, Charles, and everybody else on that roof collapsed. Immediately, people on the roof fell all the way to the bottom of this factory, 55 feet below. There weren't a lot of different floors inside of this factory. Instead, it was basically just one big 55-foot-high building that housed a massive brick structure right in the center. This brick structure was almost as tall as the entire factory itself. It was almost like the factory was just a shell built around this smaller 40-foot-tall brick structure in the middle. So, after the ceiling collapsed, Thomas fell. But miraculously, he landed on a wooden support beam that stretched across the entire factory. He managed to grab onto it, saving himself from falling all the way down. So, Thomas only fell about 5 feet, and he was okay. But he didn't have a great grip on this beam. He was holding on, but just barely. Thomas turned and looked around at what had happened below him. He could hear people screaming, and he could hear the sounds of people running around on the ground floor, trying to help those who had hit the bottom. Thomas immediately began scanning the chaos for his friend Charles, and he found him. Charles was one of the other fairly lucky people. At least in Thomas's mind, Charles seemed lucky. Instead of falling from the roof all the way to the ground, Charles and about 15 or 20 other people had fallen right onto that big brick structure that made up the main part of the factory. So Charles had only fallen maybe 10 or 15 feet onto this structure. Thomas was thinking, oh, Charles and these other people, they've survived the fall. They're okay. However, the second that Charles and the others who had supposedly been saved by landing on this brick structure hit it, despite not suffering catastrophic injuries like broken bones, these people on the brick structure began letting out these primal, blood-curdling screams. And as they did, loud popping sounds began coming from their bodies. Then, their bodies began contorting forward, almost like a bug rolling up onto itself. It would turn out this factory was not a normal factory. This was a glass factory. And in order to make glass, you need to heat sand and other chemicals up to extraordinarily high temperatures. You need a furnace that can literally burn hotter than lava. And so that huge brick structure that was housed in the middle of this 5-story tall factory was a glass furnace, and it was on. Even though the inside of this furnace was the hottest place, at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the outside of this furnace, where Charles and the others had landed, was still extremely hot. It was so hot that the factory workers couldn't even go near the furnace, even with special protective equipment on. The only way they could work with this furnace was by using long metal pokers to work the flames and the glass from a distance. So, the instant that Charles and the others landed on the top of this furnace, they began to light on fire. Those snapping sounds that were coming from their bodies was the sound of them instantly igniting. Thomas and the others who had initially survived this horrible collapse could only watch in horror as Charles and the others shrieked, and their bodies continued to contort as they burned and smoldered. Charles's body rolled up so tightly that he began to roll down the curved side of the furnace. At some point, his body slipped into a crack in the furnace, and he actually fell into the flames inside, at which point he finally went silent. Around the time that Charles and the others stopped shrieking, a number of people who were just out on the road heard the commotion and came running inside. One of them was Thomas's father. In a terrible twist of fate, he looked up and saw his son Thomas clinging to that beam. But it was so hot inside the factory that Thomas was sweating profusely. He was losing his grip, and it was getting really hard to hold on to the beam. And his father watched as Thomas lost his grip and fell the remaining 10 feet down onto the furnace exterior. He landed feet first, then he fell onto his stomach and his face. He immediately ignited on fire, began shrieking, and then he too went silent. All told, 23 people would be killed during this roof collapse, and dozens more would be horribly injured and disfigured. This collapse goes down as one of the very worst disasters in sports history. However, on this day, the crowd inside the stadium was so caught up in the game that they actually didn't notice this horrible tragedy taking place just 100 feet away from where they were. It wasn't until the end of the game, when the winning team's fans carried their players out of the stadium in a kind of spontaneous victory parade, that they walked out onto the street and saw all the burnt, rolled-up corpses of the people who had landed on the furnace. In 1996, a 21-year-old named Katie Fleming was studying French at the University of Oregon. That summer, she was invited to go on a camping trip with some very close friends and some people she had not met before. Their destination was a beautiful spot along the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California. But as soon as they got there, Katie didn't take in any of the beautiful scenery. Instead, her attention was fixated solely on a 5-year-old named James Kim, who was one of those people she had not met before on the trip. For the people who were on that trip, they would later say that James and Katie just immediately fell in love with each other. For the entire duration of the trip, they were completely inseparable. And when they got back from the trip, James actually moved from Seattle, Washington, down to Oregon to be with Katie. After Katie graduated from college, the two of them got married in Las Vegas and then settled down in San Francisco. James, who had always loved technology, was quickly hired by a major tech company. His job was to try out new technology and then write reviews for the average consumer. Basically, James got paid to play with the latest toys, and he absolutely loved his job. The couple also opened two of their own boutique stores in San Francisco. One was an apothecary, and the other sold eccentric clothing. Those two shops were managed full-time by Katie. By 2006, the Kim family had become very successful financially, and they had also grown in size. They now had a 4-year-old daughter named Penelope and a 7-month-old daughter named Sabine. Katie and James both adored their kids, but James especially was known for blowing off virtually everything and anyone just to be with his daughters. In fact, his friends and family would say you couldn't even have a conversation with James if his daughters were in the same room. He would just get distracted and stare at his daughters, and then he would eventually just leave the conversation mid-sentence to go play with them. James was also known to bring his daughters to work with him virtually every chance he got, even if it wasn't really allowed at his company. On Friday, November 17th, James, Katie, and their two daughters loaded up into their station wagon and then drove north to Seattle. They planned on spending the Thanksgiving holiday with James's aunt and uncle who lived in the city. Also, James and Katie were considering leaving San Francisco and moving somewhere else, and Seattle seemed like a natural landing spot for them. So this trip served two purposes: a chance to see family and a chance to explore the area. Late on that Friday night, after a very long drive, they finally arrived in Seattle. For the next couple of days, they had a wonderful time visiting with family and having a big Thanksgiving dinner. On Friday, November 24th, the day after Thanksgiving, James, Katie, and their daughters loaded back up into their station wagon early in the morning. They said goodbye to James's aunt and uncle, and then they hit the road. But instead of just driving straight all the way back to San Francisco, which would have taken the entire day and then some, they decided to make a stop in Portland, Oregon. One of Katie's very close friends from college was going to meet them there for lunch. After about a 4-hour drive, they arrived in Portland, met up with Katie's friend, and had a nice lunch. Afterwards, the family retired to a hotel where they crashed for the night. The next morning, the original plan was to just get in the car and drive all the way back to San Francisco. But Katie suggested to James that instead of just driving all day, they should stay in Portland for part of the day, leave in the afternoon, and then stop somewhere between Portland and home. They would break up the long drive one more time. James thought it was a great idea. They pulled out a map, and Katie found a nice, family-friendly vacation spot that was almost exactly halfway between where they were and their home in San Francisco. It was called the 22-Ton Lodge, and it was located on the coast of Oregon in a town called Gold Beach. James and Katie thought it was perfect. This was exactly what they needed. Katie called the lodge and made reservations for that night. That afternoon, after the family had spent a nice day in Portland, they hopped back in the car and began traveling south towards the lodge. At about 8:30 inches the evening, the family was still on the road making their way when James got really hungry and said they should pull over and get a bite to eat. So, the family pulled over at a Denny's restaurant in Central Oregon. They went inside, and after a quick meal, they got back out on the road at 9 p.m. From the Denny's, it was about a 2.5-hour drive to the lodge. But after driving for 2 more hours, James realized that they had missed a turn somewhere. He told Katie about it, they looked at the map, and they realized that if they were to backtrack all the way to that missed turn, it would add several more hours onto their trip. So, they began looking for an alternative path, and they found one. Instead of going all the way west to the coast, and then all the way south to the lodge, which was their original plan, they could just go south from where they currently were until they were parallel with the lodge, and then from there, they could just cut west along a road called Bear Camp Road. It looked like it would go straight to their destination. But what this map did not do a good job of explaining was just how dangerous Bear Camp Road was. It started at an elevation of 900 feet, but it very quickly climbed all the way up to 4,000 feet of elevation before it went over the backside of a mountain and down to Gold Beach, where the lodge was. While the road is paved, it's incredibly narrow, and it's basically cut into the side of a mountain. This means there are very steep drop-offs throughout most of the drive, and there are no guardrails protecting people from falling off the edge. The summer is really the only time people should be on Bear Camp Road, because that's when the road is maintained. In the winter, the road is not plowed, it's not maintained at all, and so even a light snowstorm could make the road totally impassable. and the road cuts through a very remote section of Oregon where there just aren't many people around. So, if you get into trouble out there, you are probably on your own. But the Kims were not aware of any of the dangers this road possessed. So, after going south for a while, they did turn on to Bear Camp Road and began slowly driving up the mountain. As James was driving, Katie fell asleep in the passenger seat and the girls fell asleep in the back. Outside, it began to snow. An hour later, Katie woke up from her sleep. The first thing she noticed was that it was now snowing so hard outside that James had the windshield wipers on full blast, and you could still barely see out the front windshield. She looked at her husband, and he was hunched over the steering wheel, his knuckles white, looking intently out the window. She asked him, "What's going on? Should we stop? Should we turn around?" James, without even looking at her, said, "Yeah, honey, I do want to turn around, but the road is so narrow we can't." Then he told his wife that earlier. They had actually driven through a fork in the road where there was enough space to turn around, and so now he was just hopeful that there would be another fork somewhere up ahead that would allow them to do the same. Katie was not excited about this idea, but she trusted James, and she said, "Okay, let's keep going." So James just continued driving up this mountain pass, and you have to understand, they were driving on what was basically a cliff. On the left side, to James's left, was just a sheer drop-off, and the road was totally slick from the snow. Periodically, as James was driving, even though he was only going about 5 miles per hour, the car would begin to slip and slide right on the edge of this cliff. It was a very, very stressful ride. After several more miles of this, they still hadn't reached any kind of turnaround. In fact, they would have to periodically stop on inclines, put on the emergency brake, and one of them would have to get out of the car and clear branches and rocks out of this tiny little road just to continue onward. Finally, Katie said to James, "You have to stop. You have to back out of here. That's our only choice right now." So, James put the car in reverse, and he opened his car door so he could look down at the edge of the cliff to make sure he didn't accidentally veer off of it. Very slowly, without even applying the gas, he began backing up, making sure he didn't go off the cliff. They did this for hours and hours. It must have been unbelievably stressful. But finally, they made it back to that fork in the road that James had seen much earlier, and now they had a decision to make. They had two paths they could take. They could turn around completely and drive nose out along the path they came in on, all the way back to the highway. But that was a very long drive, and they knew that road was treacherous with its cliff drop-off. It was really just as dangerous as what they had just been on, and they were not keen to be on that road again, considering the weather. Or they could turn left and go down the mountain on a path that was way wider than the one they had been on. It looked like a huge road, and it seemed to go straight to the bottom of the mountain. They were thinking, "We don't know where this goes. The signage isn't clear. But you have to figure, if you're going lower in elevation, the weather won't be as bad. And maybe if we go down this road, there will be houses, or a gas station, or something. Whatever it is, it's probably better than going back the way we came." So, James turned the car and began driving down this new road. Unfortunately, this was the worst choice they could have made. This road they were now on was a long, winding dead end that was used by loggers in the summer. Normally, this mistake by the Kim family would have been caught, because there was supposed to be a big yellow gate that sat across this road just a little ways past the fork, blocking all traffic from going any further. But vandals had recently come up and cut the lock on this gate, swung it open, and then locked it in the open position. So the gate was completely off the road. As the Kims drove past the spot where they normally would have been stopped, they didn't even see a gate. There was no gate anywhere, so they just kept on driving. From where this gate should have been, the road went from paved to dirt, full of potholes, and it narrowed considerably. The couple drove for 15 miles on this very tight, winding road that once again was on a cliffside. Finally, they reached another fork in the road where they could either go right or go straight, but there was no sign telling them which way led to what. James stopped the car right in the middle of this intersection, and he and Katie looked at each other. They knew they were in trouble. They got their phones out and tried to call for help, but they had no service. As they were struggling to place calls, one of them realized that it was no longer snowing. It was actually raining, and a lot of the snow on the ground seemed to be getting washed away. After not being able to place any calls for several minutes, they decided, you know what, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, we're tired, let's just sleep here. We'll leave the car running so it'll be nice and warm. And when we wake up in the morning, This rain will most likely have washed away all the snow, and we can just drive out of here." The two of them were kind of relieved as they said this out loud. The situation wasn't nearly as bad as it seemed. They would be just fine. So Katie, James, and their two daughters fell asleep with the car running, nice and warm. But when they woke up, Katie and James realized their situation had gotten much, much worse. At some point in the night after they had fallen asleep, the temperature must have dropped again, and that rain had turned into very heavy snow. All the water on the ground had frozen, and then almost a foot of new snow had fallen on top of it. They were completely and totally stuck. But Katie and James didn't panic. They remembered that when they first turned onto Bear Camp Road, they had seen a snowplow truck parked off on the side of the road. To them, that meant that if it snowed along Bear Camp Road, the road would get plowed. So, that day, the Kims just stayed inside their car. They ate snacks, they read books, they kept the heater on, and they waited to be rescued. But over the course of that entire day, nobody came down that road. No plows, no anybody. Katie and James continuously tried their cell phones, trying to get a signal to call for help, but they never had any service. They also continuously honked the horn in case someone was in the area who might hear them, but no one ever came to their rescue. By the end of that Sunday night, Katie and James were really starting to get worried. They had a 4-year-old and a 7-month-old. They could not be out here for very much longer. But they began to tell each other, "You know what? It's Sunday. Maybe the plows don't come through on Sundays. Maybe they just don't work out here on the weekend." They convinced themselves that tomorrow, Monday, the plows would be out, they would come by, and they would save them. They also reassured each other that tomorrow, Monday, was the day they were supposed to be back in San Francisco. People were bound to notice their absence, report it to the police, and a search party would come out and save them. So tomorrow, they were going to get found. That night, Katie and James put their two daughters in their car seats, and James read them some bedtime stories. Then the family fell asleep. The next day, Monday, the family did a lot of the same things they did the day before. They sat in their car, they tried to keep their spirits high, they tried to use their cell phones, which didn't work. They honked their horns to get people's attention, which didn't work. They tried to ration their food, and the whole time they kept their eyes on each side of the road, hoping a plow would come through. But all day long, no trucks, no plows, nothing came down the road. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family's absence was noticed by a family friend, but they didn't report it to the police because they just figured the Kim family had decided to stay out a little bit longer and would be back soon. By Monday night, Katie and James were officially terrified. They were almost out of fuel for their car, and they were almost out of food. In fact, to compensate for their low amount of food, Katie had begun not only breastfeeding her 7-month-old, but also her 4-year-old. Also, outside of their car, bears began to assemble and check them out. At first, Katie and James would scream and yell to try to scare them off, but the bears ultimately were not that fazed by them. They weren't aggressive, but it meant the family did not feel comfortable getting out of their car. They were in this very claustrophobic situation, literally trapped inside this small car where all the windows were covered with snow. They couldn't go anywhere, they couldn't call anyone, and they were running out of supplies. It was a terrifying situation to be in. Katie and James had been really strong up to this point, but around this time, they began to act scared. And their kids picked up on it and started acting scared and fearful too. The parents were trying their best to calm them down and tell them everything was going to be fine and they were going to get out of here soon. But in reality, Katie and James knew that if they didn't get found soon, they were probably going to die. The next day when they woke up, which was Tuesday, again, no cars or trucks came down either road, there were no plows, the snow just continued to pile up, and their food was running unbelievably low. At one point, James actually left the car and went out looking for bear droppings because there were bears all over the place now. He would pull the undigested berries out of their droppings, and he and Katie began eating those. But after a while, they decided that was not a good idea because they might poison themselves. Their daughters, who the day before had been acting out of fear and anxiety, were now lethargic and quiet. The parents' response to this was to start fighting with each other about whose fault this was, when in reality, they were just totally scared about what might happen to them. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family had still not been reported to the police. And so that night, Tuesday night, the Kim family once again huddled up inside of their car. James read the kids some books, and then they all fell asleep. The next morning, Wednesday, they ran out of gas for their car, and so they had no way to heat themselves. James got the spare tire out of the back of the car, rounded up some magazines they had, and he lit a fire for the family to stand around and try to warm up by. It worked, but the fire very quickly died out, and they couldn't find any wood that wasn't soaking wet to put on it. Before long, they did not have a fire. All day that day, James and Katie were desperately looking up the road, hoping that a car or truck would come through. They never did. James and Katie tried their cell phones repeatedly, but they never got service. They honked their horns and screamed for help, but nobody heard them. Before long, it was dark again, and the family was huddled up inside their now freezing car. All they could hear outside was the sound of bears marching around the area. I'm sure James and Katie thought to themselves, I wonder if we'll survive the night. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, that family friend who had noticed the Kims were gone on Monday finally went to the police on Wednesday afternoon and reported them missing. A search party was being organized that night, but of course the Kim family would have no way of knowing that. The next morning, Thursday, the Kim family woke up. They had survived the night. But at this point, James and Katie were speaking openly about the real possibility that they all might die. In fact, Katie said to James, "You have to promise me. If our 2 kids die out here, you have to kill me too." And James said he would. At this point, Katie and James did not believe a truck or a car or anything was going to drive down this road and save them. They believed their only hope of being rescued was by sending a smoke signal up into the air that a pilot might see. So, they pulled off all 4 tires of their car. Then they pulled everything out of the car that might burn and stacked it on the tires. That included Penelope's prized stuffed lamb. Once they had their big pile, they lit it on fire. Fairly quickly, a large, black, billowing cloud of smoke was going straight up into the sky. For a minute, the Kim family was very optimistic that they were about to be found. Surely, someone was going to see this smoke and come find them. But unfortunately, the fire burned out very quickly. They couldn't light it again, and nobody flew overhead. Before long, the family was once again huddled inside their freezing cold car that night. There were bears walking around outside. They were basically out of food. Their kids weren't even crying anymore. They were just silent and cold and miserable. As they were all shivering and trying to stay warm, James realized he needed to do something drastic, or his family was going to die. The next morning, Friday, when they got up, James told Katie that he had been studying the map. He said there was a town about 4 miles to the east called Gallus that he believed he could get to in about 2 hours. Katie immediately said, "No, you cannot leave us. We need you here. There's probably a search party out there looking for us right now. We need to stay together so we can all be found." But James's instincts were telling him that no one was coming for them, or at least no one was going to actually find them in time. Their only hope was if he ventured off and found help. Katie finally, reluctantly, agreed to let him go because he seemed so confident. At 7:45 inches the morning, James gave his 2 daughters a big hug and a kiss, told them he loved them and that he would see them soon. Then he hugged his wife and said he loved her, and then he turned around and walked up the road out of sight. At the same time, unbeknownst to the Kim family, hundreds of searchers and multiple helicopters were now all over Bear Camp Road looking for them. 2 days later, on Sunday, December 3rd, a full week after the family had originally gotten stuck, a helicopter pilot that was part of the search effort was flying around Bear Camp Road when he noticed footprints in the snow below. He started following these footprints. Eventually, the footprints disappeared under some trees, and he couldn't pick them up again. Without much fuel left, he decided he would just backtrack and follow the footprints back to their origin. He retraced these footprints for quite a while until he came to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a car, and next to the car was Katie, waving an umbrella back and forth. The pilot immediately knew who he was looking at, but he didn't have enough fuel to actually land and pick her and her family up. So instead, he just hovered down as low as he could and made good eye contact with her to reassure her. "I see you and we're coming for you." Then he marked their location on his map. He flew off to the search headquarters, and just minutes later, another helicopter was sent up. They flew to that same location and were able to land in the clearing. As soon as the pilot got out, he saw Katie running up to him carrying her 2 daughters, who looked like they were in pretty good shape. She was crying tears of joy and thanking him profusely. Then, when she was right up in front of him, she said, "Are you here because of my husband? Did James tell you where we were?" The pilot looked visibly confused. Katie picked up on it, and she explained how just 2 days earlier, James had left to go to the town of Gallus to get help, and he still hadn't come back yet. At this point, the pilot understood what was happening. He looked down and said, "No, ma'am, we still have not found James." Katie was devastated. She cried as she and her daughters were loaded into the helicopter, airlifted out of the forest, and brought to a hospital. There, they would all make full recoveries. Meanwhile, the search effort, which had been spread all over Bear Camp Road, was suddenly focused exclusively on the area around where their car was found. Professional trackers were brought in to look for James's tracks. They found them fairly quickly and began following them. After leaving his family to go look for help, which must have been the most difficult decision he had ever made in his entire life, James had walked 3 miles up the road they came in on. Then, instead of continuing on that road in the direction of Gallus, he deviated and walked off the road. He went straight down one of the cliffs until he hit a river. It's believed that maybe he saw the river from up on the road and thought that it would be a faster way to get to town. As he walked, he would leave behind him little bits of torn clothing and torn paper to create a trail of where he was going, presumably so he could backtrack to his family if he needed to. He got down to this river, and for several miles, he walked downstream. After being gone for at least 2 hours and not reaching the town of Gallus, he must have realized he had either gone the wrong way or he had miscalculated the distance. But either way, he did not turn around and go back to his family. Instead, he pressed on, believing he was their only hope. On he went, crossing over rivers, getting totally soaked in frigid water. He went up and down mountains, all over these totally rugged areas, in nothing but street clothes. He had on sneakers, pants, and a jacket. He had no food and no water. He just kept on going until it was nightfall. He had covered about 10 miles at this point. He laid down and he went to sleep. That night must have been absolutely horrible as he thought about his family, alone in the woods somewhere. He probably wondered if they were still alive. The temperature was in the 30s, and again, he was just in street clothes. But he survived the night. The next morning, that Saturday, he got up and he was right back at it, despite the fact that he was physically wrecked at this point. But for him, he didn't care. He was doing it for his family. All day, he hiked in and out of freezing cold streams, up and down mountains, until finally he found himself at the bottom of a deep ravine next to a river. He just fell to his knees, fell forward, and died. He had literally just kept on going, looking for help for his family, until he eventually succumbed to hypothermia. James's body was located 2 days after his wife and his daughters were successfully rescued. It would turn out the town of Gallus was not 4 miles away from the family's car, it was about 15 miles away. But that's as the crow flies, from point A to point B on a map in a straight line. When you're actually hiking in the wilderness, you don't go in straight lines because there are mountains and rivers and things that get in the way. In order to get to Gallus from where their car was, James would have had to travel 30 or 40 miles, zigging and zagging up over 4 different mountains. It was a suicide mission from the start. James ultimately covered 16 miles through some of the most treacherous terrain in the country, wearing nothing but his street clothes. The professional trackers that followed his 16-mile trail to his body called his journey superhuman. The helicopter pilot would later say he never would have found Katie and the girls had he not spotted those footprints first, and then traced them all the way back to that clearing. And it would turn out those footprints were made by James after he left his family and walked off to get help. And so, even though it cost him his life, James did ultimately save his family. In Moscow, Russia, a group of friends rented out a private section of a spa that included a steam room and a small indoor pool. After the reservations were made, an influencer named Yekaterina Didenko and all of her influencer friends began eagerly talking about how excited they were for this party on their various social media accounts. When the day finally came, February 28th, which was Didenko's birthday, she, her husband, and the 8 other people they invited all descended on the spa. They went inside to their private area, and it was great. There was food, there was alcohol, there was music. They were jumping into the pool, getting in the hot tub, and everyone was just having a great time. Everyone was taking pictures and filming and live streaming. It was going as well as it possibly could be. At some point, Didenko's husband signaled to the rest of the group, minus Didenko, and they all began to pull out these white hazardous material suits. Imagine what you would see in a movie if there was some huge chemical leak, a full-body white suit with a mask. They all started putting on these hazmat suits, and they gave one to Didenko, who put it on as well. They told her this was part of her big surprise. Now, it's unclear if Didenko actually didn't know what was going to happen next, or if she was just pretending to be surprised because it would look better on social media. This was all being filmed, and she was an influencer after all. Either way, she put on her hazmat suit. Once everyone had their suits on, Didenko's husband wheeled in a huge cooler, the kind you would bring to a picnic, and he placed it right on the edge of the pool. When he opened the lid, the crowd all gasped and laughed and smiled and filmed as huge clouds of white smoke or steam came pouring out of it. What it was roughly 55 pounds of dry ice. Dry ice is just frozen carbon dioxide. It's commonly used for things like refrigerating perishable goods for long periods of time because dry ice stays cold for a really long time. Also, because of the huge white gas clouds that come off of it, it's very commonly used as a sort of spooky decoration. And that's what Didenko's husband planned to use this dry ice for. He was going to dump it into the pool to create those big white gas clouds all over the surface of the water. They call it dry ice because as it starts to heat up, it doesn't melt into a liquid state the way frozen water does. Instead, it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state. Dry ice is considered to be quite hazardous if it's handled inappropriately. And while these partygoers all had their hazmat suits on, it's unlikely they were actually wearing them for safety. It's far more likely they were wearing them because it would look good on social media and would kind of hype up the stunt they were about to do. After the dry ice was revealed inside the cooler, Didenko's husband and another one of the partygoers grabbed the sides of the cooler and they dumped its entire contents directly into the water. As soon as the dry ice hit the water, it rapidly began to warm up, which caused a massive, almost explosive release of carbon dioxide gas that completely filled the lower half of the room. None of the partygoers were even a little bit fazed by what was happening. They didn't realize how dangerous this actually was. They were just filming and laughing and thinking this was so cool. Then, Didenko's husband actually leaped through the cloud of gas into the water and disappeared below the surface. Shortly after that, 2 other partygoers also leaped into the pool. One of the main reasons dry ice is considered to be so hazardous if handled inappropriately is because it emits carbon dioxide gas, which at high concentrations will displace oxygen. So, imagine if you're in a very small room that has very poor ventilation. If you had a lot of carbon dioxide in there, you would suffocate. This indoor pool area was a small, confined space with poor ventilation. So, the 7 people who were still on the pool deck shortly after the dry ice had been tossed into the pool started to realize it was really hard to breathe. The oxygen was basically being sucked out of the room. They were able to turn and actually run out of the pool deck area before it was too late. Meanwhile, Didenko's husband and the other 2 people who had leaped into the pool, when they came back to the surface, they took a breath thinking they would be breathing in oxygen. But instead, they breathed in an entire lungful of concentrated carbon dioxide. In addition to displacing oxygen at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation, carbon dioxide is also poisonous. So, when the 3 of them surfaced, they breathed in this poisonous gas. This caused 2 of them to immediately pass out and then die right there in the water. The 3rd person, Didenko's husband, managed to stay conscious enough that he was able to barely climb out of the pool. He tried to get to the door, but he couldn't get out in time. Eventually, he was pulled out and rushed to the hospital, but he would later die not only from carbon dioxide poisoning, but also from having gone without oxygen for as long as he had. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. At around 11:40 inches the morning on the 21st of December 2003, 3 young men who had been close friends since they were little kids all piled into a truck and started driving south. The group was made up of 22-year-old Brett Mann and his 219-year-old friends, Sean Blowers and Ashley McGuff. They all lived in a coastal city called Darwin, which is the capital of Australia's Northern Territory. Now, the Northern Territory, also known to locals as the Top End, is a massive stretch of land in the central northern part of the continent. To give you some perspective, it's about 6 times bigger than the entire United Kingdom, but it has about 280 times fewer people living in it. The UK is home to around 70 million people, while the Top End has a population of only about 250,000. And what's even crazier is that half of those people all live in that one city, Darwin. There are a lot of reasons why so few people live in the top end, ranging from politics to a serious lack of infrastructure. But the most obvious reason is that this part of Australia is just unbelievably wild, rugged, and dangerous. It's scorching hot all year round, and the weather itself can be incredibly unpredictable and violent. And of course, there's the old saying that pretty much every animal there is actively trying to kill you and each other. But for Brett, Sean, and Ashley, this was just home. They had grown up in Darwin, so they were totally used to all the hazards of living in the top end. It wasn't something they spent a lot of time worrying about. What they were concerned with was a much more common problem for young guys: finding something to do and not getting bored. On this particular day, to fight off that boredom, the three of them had decided to drive out to a salt flat located about 50 miles southwest of Darwin. It was this huge, wide-open plain where they could just blast around on their quad bikes for hours. And so, they got their quad bikes loaded up into a trailer, hitched it to their truck, hopped inside, and at 11:40 a.m., they began their journey south out of the city. The first road they took was a pretty desolate dirt track that wound its way through the wilderness. It took them past the iconic eucalyptus trees that Australia is so famous for, past palm trees, and past these giant termite mounds that look like alien sculptures sticking out of the ground. After driving on this dirt road for about half an hour, the three friends passed a place called the Tumbling Waters Holiday Park. It was a kind of vacation resort for adventurous families. But beyond this park, there was basically no more civilization. They were heading straight into the true Australian outback. This resort was the last little mark of the world they were leaving behind. And so, the trio kept driving for another 30 minutes past the park. At some point, the trees on both sides of the road started to get thicker and thicker, more and more dense, until they began to sort of lean over the road. It started to feel like they were driving through a tunnel in the middle of a jungle. The guys would have recognized this change in the scenery. It meant they were getting close to the Finnis River, which was just off to their right, hidden beyond all the trees. They couldn't see it, but they knew it was there. Now, the Finnis River wasn't some huge, massive waterway. It was a 30-mile stretch of water that ran from east to west through the top end. And it was known for being very brackish and incredibly dark. You couldn't see into the water more than an inch or two, so it always looked almost jet black. The friends continued driving along through this jungle-like atmosphere until the trees on the left side of the road started to thin out again. And then, finally, the dense foliage gave way and revealed the salt flats stretching out to their left. At that point, the driver pulled the truck over to the right side of the road, where the vegetation was still really thick. The three of them jumped out of the truck, walked around to the trailer, and dropped the gate. One by one, they rolled their quad bikes off, and then each of them hopped on and took off, racing out onto the flats. That day, the flats were actually super muddy. It had rained really heavily in the area recently, so the ground was soft and wet. The guys spent just as much time racing each other across the open expanse as they did trying to ride up close to one another and spray huge arcs of mud all over each other. For hours, they were just out there having an amazing time, completely carefree. Then, at about 4:30 inches the afternoon, they decided it was probably time to call it a day. They drove their muddy quad bikes back over to the truck, rode them up onto the trailer, and locked everything down. They were just about to climb back into the truck and head home when one of them had an idea. He suggested they head down to the river to rinse off their clothes and get all the caked-on mud off of them. Now, you really have to understand something about the top end. The one place you want to spend the absolute least amount of time is in the water. People who live there just assume that any natural body of water that isn't clearly and officially marked as a designated swimming area has at least one animal lurking in it that will kill you. This is a literal precaution that people in the top end take very seriously. And this specific section of the Finnis River, the one these three friends were thinking about jumping into, was definitely not a designated swimming area. It was a place that should have been avoided. But you have to remember, these three guys had grown up in the top end. They were used to living in this kind of wild environment. And besides, they had been to these salt flats so many times over the years. They had jumped into the Finnis River before to wash off or go for a quick swim, and absolutely nothing bad had ever happened. So the idea that the river could be genuinely dangerous to them didn't really cross their minds. They probably felt like, you know what, we've been there, we've done that, nothing is going to happen to us. And so they left the truck and started walking away from the salt flats, pushing their way into the thick mangrove forest that was only a few feet off the road. They began making their way towards the river. Normally, the walk from the road through the forest to the riverbank would take about 10 minutes. But after walking through this mangrove swamp for maybe just a minute, they were already standing in river water. It was only a couple of inches deep, but it was a clear sign to the guys that the river was very swollen from all the recent rain. It had overflowed its natural boundaries and had flooded the surrounding mangrove forest. But the three guys just kind of looked at each other and probably thought, what's the big deal? I'm sure we'll be fine. And so they kept moving forward. But as the mangroves started to thin out, they began to slow down quite a bit. This was because the banks on the edges of the Finnis River were known to be very, very steep. If you were standing on dry land, if there was no flooding, and you were right on the edge of the river, taking just 1 or 2 steps into the water would cause you to slip down an embankment and be completely submerged with the water way over your head. But as these guys were walking, because the ground was flooded with that dark brackish water, they couldn't see the ground at all. And so they had no way of knowing where the sudden drop-off into the deeper river was. So they started to move much more carefully. And then, when all the trees were practically gone, they knew they were right on the edge. Suddenly, one of them actually slipped and started to tumble down the embankment for a second. But he managed to turn and grab onto one of the thick roots of a mangrove tree and pull himself back up. After seeing this, the other two walked over and stood right next to him. And the three of them just stood there, looking out at this pitch-black river that was very clearly moving much faster than normal because of all the excess rain. But they looked at each other and still thought, you know what? It's not that big of a deal. We'll just hold on to the roots of these mangroves, lower ourselves over the edge, wash ourselves off, and then pull ourselves back up. No problem. And so, that's what they did. They each turned around and grabbed a thick, sturdy root from one of the many mangrove trees that marked the edge of the forest. And while holding on tightly, they would lower their bodies down past the embankment until they were submerged in the cool water. They scrubbed all the mud off themselves, being very careful not to let go of the mangrove root at any point. Then, just as they were about to finish up and pull themselves back onto the flooded ground to get back to their truck, Brett lost his balance. Somehow, his hand slipped, and he let go of the mangrove root. He slid down the steep, hidden embankment, and suddenly the powerful current grabbed him and pulled him away from his friends out toward the middle of the river. Before he knew it, he was getting pulled quickly downstream. He yelled out to Ashley and Sean, who still had their backs to him. They turned around immediately, saw their friend in trouble, and without a second of hesitation, they instinctively leaped into the river to try and get to him and help swim him back to the side. Now, all three of them were very good, competent swimmers. So, at this point, it wasn't a high panic situation. It was more of an inconvenience, and maybe even a little bit funny. That's why they jumped in so readily. They figured, worst case scenario is we all drift down the river for a bit, get out somewhere down there, and then we have a long walk back to our truck. But as soon as Sean and Ashley were free floating in that river, they felt just how strong that current really was. It was way stronger than they had been anticipating. And that's when they actually started to get a little bit worried. They looked up ahead of them, and Brett, who had been in the water for maybe 10 or 15 seconds before they jumped in, had already been swept much farther downstream than them. And so they decided, okay, we have to get out of here, but we need to get to Brett first. We all need to get out at the same place. So they made a plan. They were going to swim downstream, meet up with Brett, and then all three of them would get the heck out of that river as fast as they possibly could. They yelled out to Brett, "Hey, we're coming to get you," and they started swimming as fast as they possibly could. With the help of the strong current pushing them, they managed to catch up to Brett relatively quickly, maybe in just a couple of minutes. When they reached him, Sean and Ashley got in front of Brett, and then the three of them stopped actively swimming. They just let the current carry them downstream together. As they were drifting, they started scanning the left side of the river, looking for a solid clump of mangrove trees that they could swim into. They knew that unless there was something solid to grab onto at the edge of the river, they wouldn't be able to pull themselves out against the current. At this point, the trio was definitely uncomfortable being in the water because of how strong that current was. But they were still confident that they were going to find a good landing spot, they were going to get out, and this whole thing would just turn into a great story to tell later. And so Sean was in the front, Ashley was right behind him, and then Brett was behind Ashley. They were all about an arm's length away from each other, just drifting down this dark river for a couple of minutes, looking over to their left for a viable place to get out. And then, all of a sudden, Ashley just yells out, "Hey, I seen something in the water. We need to get out, find the nearest tree, get out, get out, get out." Sean immediately started to panic. He didn't even turn around to see what was going on behind him. Adrenaline kicked in, and he just started swimming as fast as he possibly could toward a tree that was sticking out of the water. It was literally growing right in the middle of the river. He swam frantically up to this tree and managed to climb up to the first fork, which was maybe 6 or 8 feet above the water. As soon as he was safely up there, he turned around and looked down. He saw Ashley right below him. He reached down and hoisted Ashley up to the first fork with him. And then the pair of them turned around again to help Brett. But Brett wasn't there. And so they looked all around thinking, okay, did Brett not make it to the tree? Did the current pull him around it? Is he at some other tree? They started yelling out his name, looking for him everywhere, but there was no sign of Brett. They started talking to each other, Ashley and Sean, saying, "Did he call out? Did you hear something? Did he give any indication about where he was going?" And they both said, "No, I have no idea where he is." They started climbing a little bit higher up the tree, trying to get a better vantage point to look down and up the river to see if maybe they could spot him somewhere. And then, all of a sudden, Sean noticed something yellow flash beneath them in the water. He looked straight down and saw this yellow object just under the surface. He nudged Ashley and said, "Look." And so Ashley looked down too. As they were both looking, now about 10 feet above the water, they saw this yellow thing start to rise up toward the surface. The water was so dark that they really couldn't tell what anything was unless it was right at the top. And so they watched this yellow shape, and then suddenly it broke the surface of the water, and they saw it was Brett. He was wearing his yellow jacket. That's what they had seen. But Brett was in the mouth of a 13-foot-long saltwater crocodile. He was face down, and his entire left side was being held in the animal's massive jaws. And he wasn't moving. Sean and Ashley were so scared they were just frozen. They could only stare at this monster in the water that was holding their friend, and there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. For 2 full minutes, they just stood there on that branch, looking at this animal, wondering what was going to happen. And for those entire 2 minutes, the crocodile stared right back up at Ashley and Sean, as if it was showing them what it was going to do to them too once they got in the water. It was like it was saying, "I've done this to your friend, and I'm getting you next." And so they stared at this animal, and then suddenly, it just kind of dipped underneath the water, back down into the black abyss. And it, along with Brett, just disappeared. Ashley and Sean were so terrified that they couldn't even grieve for their friend. They couldn't feel sad for him. It was like their brains just switched completely into survival mode. And without saying a single word to each other, they just started climbing up that tree as fast and as high as they possibly could. They only managed to get up a couple more feet to 2 more branches. One was at about 10 or 12 feet off the water, and the other was at about 15 feet. Sean made it onto the lower branch, and Ashley scrambled up to the slightly higher one. Once they were both situated on their branches, with one arm wrapped firmly around the trunk of the tree, they were able to kind of breathe for a second and take stock of their situation. And even though, of course, the elephant in the room was that their friend had just been eaten by a crocodile, it was like they couldn't even process that yet. Instead, they started talking about a plan. They thought, okay, our families, they're going to notice we're gone, and they're going to tell the police. The police will launch a search, and they're going to come find us. Both of them were confident, or at least they acted confident, that this was going to happen. But they also knew that there was no timeline for it. It could be hours, or it could be days until anyone found them. And as these two teens were sitting on their branches, the true reality of their situation really started to come crashing down on them. Because yeah, they were safe in this tree, but how long could they possibly stay up there? I mean, eventually, they were going to have to fall asleep. And if they fell asleep, were they going to fall out of the tree and land right in the water with that crocodile? They just didn't know how this was going to end. And so, as the two of them began comforting each other, reassuring each other that, oh no, it's going to be just fine, someone's going to find us tonight or tomorrow, we'll be just fine. As they were doing that, Ashley suddenly stopped talking to Sean and just looked straight down at the water. Sean realized what Ashley was doing, and he followed his gaze and looked straight down too. And there, at the base of their tree, in that black water, was the 13-foot-long saltwater crocodile. It was back, and it no longer had Brett in its mouth. They had no idea where Brett was. He was just gone. Saltwater crocodiles are considered the most aggressive and dangerous crocodiles in the entire world. And they're one of only 2 crocodile species that will actively hunt humans when they get the chance. And so, these 2 teens were completely helpless in this tree. All they had was a few feet of separation from the black water and this animal down below. And so they just found themselves staring straight down at this crocodile. And in turn, the crocodile just stared right back up at them. It was very clearly waiting for them. It wanted them to come out of the tree so it could eat them. And so the crocodile just continuously repositioned itself, circling all around the base of the tree. It was just keeping the top of its head out of the water so its eyes could look up at them. The teens were just praying that at some point it would grow tired of them and would leave. After several hours, right as the sun was about to set, the crocodile did seem to give up. It drifted under the water and disappeared. After a couple of minutes, Sean, who was on the slightly lower branch, decided he didn't want to be any closer to the water than he absolutely had to be. He was going to try to climb up to Ashley's branch. And so he very carefully stood up on his branch, made sure he had solid footing, and then he reached up and grabbed a higher branch with his right hand. He kind of tested it, and it felt pretty sturdy. Then he put all his weight on it and tried to reach for another branch when this one just snapped. As soon as that branch broke, Sean tumbled 10 feet straight into the water. He hit the water and went all the way under, sinking a few feet down. Immediately, he was turned around and was trying to swim as fast as he could back to the surface. He was just expecting that at any moment that crocodile was going to bite him. He finally got to the surface and looked around. It was getting dark, but he could immediately see his tree, and he realized the current had already pulled him away from it. So in a complete panic, he started swimming and kicking his legs as hard as he possibly could to get back to that tree. And he knew that the whole time he was kicking his legs, he was just attracting the attention of that crocodile. But he had nothing else he could do. There was no other tree he could reasonably get to that would provide any safety from this animal. And so, with every single ounce of energy he had left, he kicked and swam. Finally, he managed to grab onto a root of the tree that his friend was still in. He began pulling himself up, with his lower half still submerged in the water. As he was dragging himself towards the trunk of the tree, he was just waiting for that crocodile to bite down on his legs. Finally, he got to the trunk of the tree and was able to pull his body completely out of the water. He clambered up to that original branch he was on, and then he and Ashley worked together to get him all the way up to Ashley's branch. As soon as he sat down next to Ashley and he was secure, they both looked down. And just a little ways away from the tree, basically in the exact area where Sean had just landed in the water, they saw, with the little bit of light that was left, that crocodile swimming right back over to the tree. And it camped out right underneath them. Sean had gotten out just in time. When the sun finally did set, about 10 or 15 minutes later, it became pitch black. There's no ambient light in that part of the world. There aren't any buildings or cities close enough to this area. And so it was truly completely black. They could no longer see the crocodile down below, but they knew it was there because periodically they would hear it repositioning itself in the water right underneath them. Also, because it was so dark, the two teens couldn't actually see each other. And so they began holding on to each other. And anytime either of them moved, they would announce their movement to the other just so they knew they hadn't fallen asleep and weren't in the process of falling out of the tree to a horrible death. A few hours went by like this. It was just silence, with the exception of the sounds of that crocodile moving around below them. A little after midnight, a huge storm rolled into the area. It began to absolutely downpour, and the raindrops hitting the surface of the river were so loud that the teens could no longer hear the sound of the crocodile. And so they had no idea if it was still down there or not. But every time lightning would strike, it would illuminate the entire sky for just a flash of a second. And in that flash, they would look down, and there would be the crocodile. After several hours of this super intense downpour, the two teens also started to become concerned that all this additional rain could raise the water level of the river high enough that the crocodile might be able to jump out and reach their legs. But because it was so dark, they couldn't actually see the top of the water. And so they had no way of knowing if the water levels were actually rising or not. And so they both kind of sucked their legs up onto the branch and tried to make themselves as small as they possibly could while still remaining anchored to each other and also to the branch. And that's how they sat for the next several hours, just hoping they would survive the night. Finally, when the sun came up the following morning, the teens immediately noticed that the crocodile was still right below them, just lurking at the base of the tree, waiting. They also noticed that the water level of the river had clearly come up quite a bit. And so, if they weren't rescued soon, there was a good chance that with just one more heavy rainstorm, that crocodile would be in range of them. And there was nowhere else they could go. They were as high up in the tree as they could possibly get. Not to mention the fact that they were hypothermic, they were weak, they were exhausted, and if you fall asleep, you're going to fall in the water. The two teens knew they did not have much time left. Luckily, at 10 a.m. that morning, they heard the sound of a police officer who was out in the mangrove forest. It turned out their families had recognized their absence. They had called the police, and that morning a search had been launched. Rescuers had found their truck and had been walking down the river, yelling out their names. And then, finally, they found them. Initially, when the rescuers located the two teens stuck in the tree, they called in a helicopter to hover over them and lower down a ladder that they could climb up. But when the helicopter got close to the tree, the rotor wash from the spinning blades practically blew the boys out of their branches. And the crocodile was still in the water. The rescuers could see it, the boys could still see it, and so there was this real fear that the helicopter would literally send them into the water to their death. So they had to abandon the helicopter approach. However, the powerful downdraft from the helicopter's blades did ultimately scare the crocodile, and it finally swam away. As soon as the helicopter was off station, a rescue boat came in. The boat got right underneath the two boys, they jumped down into it, and they were brought to safety. The two boys were taken to a hospital where doctors determined they were physically okay, but both of them were severely traumatized from what they had just been through. As for Brett, despite an exhaustive search of that river, they never found his body. They never found any of his clothing or any of the belongings he had on him. And they never found the crocodile that killed him. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 1986, life for the Andrews family was turned completely upside down. The two teenage sisters, Annie and Jessica, suddenly and tragically lost their mother to cancer. Her death was fairly abrupt, and it caught everyone by surprise, leaving a huge hole in the family. After she was gone, Annie and Jessica lived full-time with their father, Brian. Now, Brian had always been a hard worker, but with the loss of his wife, he had to take on even more hours just to make ends meet and provide for his two daughters. The general has intensive. He was a single father now, and the weight of that was immense. For Annie and Jessica, the loss was devastating. They had been incredibly close with their mom, and now, with their dad gone at work so often, the house felt quiet and empty. The two sisters were left alone a lot, just them and their thoughts, and all they could think about was how much they missed their mother. The grief was a constant, heavy presence in the house. So one night, while Brian was out on a late shift, the girls came up with an idea. They decided they would try to use a Ouija board to contact their mom. They would later admit they didn't really expect anything to happen, but they were just so desperate for some kind of connection, any sign that she was still with them. They went down into the basement and found the old board game. They set it up, but they didn't really do any research on how a seance was supposed to work. They just sat down, put their hands on the planchette, and started asking simple questions. They asked if their mother was there. They asked if she could give them a sign. For a couple of hours, they sat there in the quiet basement, focusing all their energy on their mom. And of course, nothing really happened. The planchette didn't move on its own. There were no strange noises or flickering lights. Eventually, they decided to put the board away. But in a way, the whole experience was cathartic for them. It gave them a chance to just sit and think about their mom, to talk to her, and to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she could hear them. Even if it was just in their heads, it made them feel closer to her for a little while. So, feeling a bit better, they put the Ouija board away and went back upstairs. They had a quiet rest of the evening and eventually decided to just head to bed. Their father still wasn't home, but this was normal. They were used to it. Annie and Jessica went to their separate bedrooms, and as they were lying there in the dark trying to fall asleep, they both started to hear something. It was a faint tapping sound. At first, they probably thought they were imagining it. But the sound was persistent. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Jessica got up and quietly went into Annie's room. She whispered, asking if Annie heard the tapping too. And Annie said yes, she did. They sat there together, listening intently. The house would fall silent, and then it would start again. A soft, rhythmic tapping from somewhere deep within the structure of the house. They had never heard anything like it before. Now, these two girls were grieving deeply. Their minds immediately went back to the seance they had just performed. Could it be? Was this the sign they had asked for? They wanted to believe it so badly, they started whispering to each other that it must be their mom. She was trying to get in touch with them. The seance must have actually worked. And so, what started as a potentially scary sound turned into something hopeful. They started asking questions out loud into the empty room. They asked, "Mom, are you here with us right now?" They asked if she could show herself, if she was okay, if she was watching over them. It was a strange mix of fear and comfort. The idea of a spirit in their house was unsettling, but the thought that it was their mother's spirit there to look after them was deeply reassuring. When their father, Brian, finally got home from work that night, the tapping had stopped. The girls rushed to tell him what happened. They were excited, not scared. They told him about the Ouija board and then about the tapping sounds in the walls, convinced it was their mom. Brian was exhausted. He'd worked a long day, and he was still processing his own grief over losing his wife. He listened to his daughters, and his heart broke for them. He was sure they were just making it up, a product of their grief and their desire to have their mother back. He thought, they're struggling, they miss their mom so much, and this is how it's coming out. That first night, he even considered getting them into some kind of therapy or grief counseling, not because he was angry, but because he was worried. He saw this as a clear sign that they weren't coping well. But for now, he just tried to calm them down. He told them, "Look, girls, just go back to bed. I'm sure she's looking out for all of us." He didn't want to dismiss their feelings entirely, but he also didn't want to encourage what he saw as a fantasy. So the girls went back to their rooms, and Brian didn't think too much more of it that night. He was just a tired, grieving father worried about his kids. But the tapping didn't stop. Over the next several days, it continued, and it actually started to get more frequent. It got so persistent that it began to disturb the girls' sleep. Night after night, they would lie awake, listening to the tapping inside the walls. And every time they would get scared and call for their father to come check on it, the moment he would step into the room, the tapping would stop. It was maddening for them. It made them feel like they were going crazy. Then, other strange things started to happen. When the family would leave the house for the day, for school or work, they would come back to find things out of place. It was always small things, subtle changes. A piece of furniture would be moved just slightly from its original position. Some of the silverware in the kitchen drawer would be rearranged. Little objects on shelves would be shifted around. It was just enough to be noticeable, to create a feeling that someone or something had been there while they were gone. Of course, Annie and Jessica were convinced it was the spirit of their mother. But Brian was having none of it. He sat them down and told them firmly that this had to stop. He said, "Guys, I know this is you. I know how much you miss your mom, and I know you want this to be real. You want her to be here with us, but she's not. You have to stop moving the furniture around. This whole ghost thing is not healthy." He warned them that if it continued, he was going to insist they start seeing a grief counselor. For the girls, this was a terrible blow. They were adamant that it wasn't them. They were genuinely scared now. And the fact that their own father didn't believe them made them feel completely alone. The initial comfort they had felt, the belief that it was their mother, was starting to fade. This didn't feel like something their mom would do. Moving things around, playing games, trying to scare them, it felt more sinister. They started to think that maybe when they used that Ouija board, they had let something else in. Something evil. And now it was in their house, terrorizing them, and there was nothing they could do because the one person who was supposed to protect them thought they were making it all up. One evening in January of 1987, a few weeks into this strange ordeal, the girls were together in the front room of the house. And they started to hear the tapping sounds again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls around them. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. After weeks of being scared and feeling helpless, something inside them snapped. They felt a sudden surge of confidence, or maybe just desperation. They decided they were going to go down there and confront whatever this thing was. Their father wasn't home to help, and he wouldn't believe them anyway. They had to face this on their own. So they took a deep breath and headed for the basement stairs. As they went down, the tapping stopped. The basement was quiet and still. They looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. They couldn't find any source for the noise. Feeling a little bit foolish, like they were on a ghost hunt that had led nowhere, they turned to go back upstairs. But as they did, they saw it. Scrawled on the basement wall in what looked like red paint or marker were the words, "Come find me. I'm in your closet." They froze. This was different. This was terrifying. It was no longer just tapping or moved furniture. This was a direct message. It was confirmation that something was actively messing with them, taunting them. It wasn't their mother. This felt like a threat. The girls didn't hesitate. They screamed and ran out of the basement, out of the house, and straight next door to their neighbors. They pounded on the door, hysterical, and told their neighbors that something weird was happening in their house. They tried to explain about the writing on the wall, but they were probably not making much sense. The neighbors, seeing how genuinely terrified they were, let them in and told them to just wait there until their father got home. A little while later, they saw Brian's car pull into the driveway. They ran out and flagged him down, and he came over to the neighbor's house. The neighbor pulled Brian aside and explained what had happened, that the girls had come over in a complete panic. Annie and Jessica then told their dad that there was writing on the wall in the basement. Brian's first reaction was frustration. This was just too much. He thought now they're defacing the property to keep this fantasy going. For him, this was the line. It had gone from a coping mechanism to something totally unhealthy. Still, he went over to the house with them to see for himself. He went down into the basement, and there it was, just as they had described. Red writing on the wall. But instead of being scared, he was just angry at his daughters. He immediately ordered them to start grief counseling. This was no longer a suggestion, it was a demand. And so they began seeing a therapist. And for a while, it seemed to work. For several weeks after that incident, the house was completely silent. There was no tapping. Nothing was ever out of place. It was almost like whatever had been haunting them had just given up and left. Then, one night, Brian was working late again and the girls were home alone. They were sitting together in the front room, enjoying the peace and quiet they had finally gotten back. And then, they heard it. The tapping. It was back. They got up and slowly, cautiously made their way through the house, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It led them to Annie's bedroom. When they opened the door and looked inside, their hearts sank. Written on her bedroom wall were new words. I'm back. Find me if you can. It was happening all over again. They did the only thing they could think to do. They ran. They fled the house and went straight back to the same neighbor's house. They explained that it had happened again, begging the neighbor to believe them. The neighbor let them stay, and they all waited for Brian to come home. When he arrived, the same scene played out. He was flagged down and brought over to the neighbors. This time, when he heard the story, Brian was furious. He confronted the girls, saying, I put you in counseling. I told you to stop doing this. This is not okay. He was at his wit's end. He then told the girls and the neighbor to stay right where they were. He was going to go into that house himself and search it from top to bottom. He was going to prove to them, once and for all, that there was nothing to be afraid of. So he marched back over to his own house, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. And he stopped dead in his tracks. The house was in total disarray. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out, things were thrown everywhere. And his first thought was, the girls didn't do this. Someone else had been in his house. Suddenly, he was on edge. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold fear. He walked cautiously through the trashed rooms, listening for any sound, but it was silent. He made his way upstairs to Annie's bedroom. He saw the writing on the wall, just as they had described. And then he looked towards the closet, and he saw a man standing there. The man was wearing women's clothes. In fact, they were his dead wife's clothes. He was also wearing a wig and carrying a small hatchet. This figure, this man in a dress, was just standing in the closet, staring at Brian. Brian was completely startled. For a second, he was just frozen. Then, the man in the dress started running. He charged out of the closet, and Brian, reacting on instinct, tried to grab him to fight him, but the man was fast and managed to push past Brian and run out of the room. Brian, shaken but now filled with adrenaline, started chasing after him.
But the guy was quick. By the time Brian got downstairs, the man was gone. He searched the house frantically, but there was no sign of him. Realizing the man had a hatchet, Brian decided the safest thing to do was get out. He ran out of the house back to his neighbors and yelled for them to call 911. There was an intruder. He stayed with his daughters while the police arrived. They went into the house and conducted a thorough search. They looked everywhere, but they couldn't find anyone. They told Brian that they were sure someone had been there based on his very convincing story and the state of the house, but the person was long gone now. There wasn't much they could do other than advise him not to stay there that night. They said they would keep an eye on the house, do some patrols, but until the intruder was caught, it wasn't safe for the family to be there. And so, the family was left with no answers. Who was that person? How did he get in? And more importantly, how did he get away? Brian was racking his brain. A man in a dress carrying a hatchet is a pretty distinctive sight. How could he just vanish into the neighborhood without anyone seeing him? For the next 2 weeks, Brian and his daughters stayed with relatives. It was a horrible, traumatizing time. Brian was consumed with guilt. He felt like a terrible father. He had left his girls alone night after night in a house with some crazy person living inside of it. He had never believed them. He kept thinking about what could have happened and how it would have been all his fault. The girls were equally traumatized. They now knew that for weeks they had been interacting with a real, dangerous person who was hiding in their home, a person with an axe. But after 2 weeks, living with relatives in a cramped space was getting difficult. And at this point, they reasoned that whoever that man was, he must be long gone. The police were watching the house. They decided it was time to go home. They would get a new security system, be more careful, but they had to get back to their lives. So, they packed up their things and headed back. As Brian was driving up his own street, he looked at his house and he noticed something odd. There was a light on in one of the second-floor windows. He thought that was strange. He knew the police were patrolling the neighborhood, but he didn't think they were actually inside his house. As he was looking up at that window, about to pull into his driveway, he saw him. The man in the dress. He walked right past the window, clear as day. Brian slammed on the brakes. He immediately grabbed his daughters, made sure they were safe, and called the police again. This time, he knew the man was still inside. Police were there in seconds. They surrounded the house completely. There was no way anyone was getting out this time. With the house completely surrounded, the police finally made their entry. No one had been inside that house since Brian and the girls had left 2 weeks prior. They had locked it up tight. When the officers opened the front door, they were met with a bizarre and disturbing scene. Not only was all the furniture flipped upside down and moved all over the place again, but there were pennies glued to the ceiling, hundreds of them just stuck up there. And there was red writing everywhere on all the walls in strange, cryptic messages. The police searched the entire house again, top to bottom. But just like before, they didn't find anyone. They were about to conclude that the person had somehow slipped away again, but one of the officers who was searching the basement noticed something. He saw a small piece of wood that looked like it was covering a crawl space behind the washer and dryer. He found that he could move the appliances aside fairly easily. Behind them was a board. When he pulled the board away, it revealed the entrance to a dark, narrow crawl space. Inside this crawl space, the police made a shocking discovery. Someone had burrowed tunnels through the insulation, creating a hidden network that ran throughout the entire house inside the walls. There were small peepholes drilled into the walls in almost every room, allowing whoever was in there to look out and see everything that was going on. And as they followed this intricate maze of tunnels, they found him. Hiding deep within the walls of the house was Danny LaPlante. It turns out Danny was a teenager who had briefly dated Annie. After they had broken up, he had secretly snuck into their house and had been living in their walls for months. He had been listening to every conversation. He heard them talking about their mother's passing. He watched them through the peepholes as they performed the seance with the Ouija board. And he used all of that information to orchestrate the entire haunting. He was the one tapping on the walls. He was the one writing messages with ketchup. He would sneak out at night when they were asleep or when the house was empty to move the furniture around, and then he would slip back into his hiding spot. After Danny LaPlante was pulled out of the crawl space, he was arrested and placed in a juvenile detention center. But the story doesn't end there. Later, in 1987, after he was released, for reasons that nobody really understands, Danny broke into another family's home. And this time, he murdered almost the entire family in cold blood. The idea of someone living in your walls for months is horrifying enough. But to know that it was a psychopath like Danny LaPlante takes it to another level. That final scene, when the police go in and find the pennies glued to the ceiling and the writing everywhere before finding him in that hidden crawl space, it's like something straight out of a horror movie. It's so bizarre, it almost doesn't seem real. But it was. And you just have to think about the trauma that the Andrews family went through. Not just the loss of their mother, but then this terrifying ordeal and the horrifying realization of what could have happened to them. They were living with a future murderer and they never even knew it. It's a kind of deep-seated trauma that you can only hope they were somehow able to recover from. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.
A knock on Ashley's dorm door ruined her first day of college. 2 officers weren't there to arrest her. They said her father's heart attack 7 years earlier was actually murder. Soon, Ashley, her sister, and her mother became suspects. Then came the strangest detail. After drinking with her mom 2 nights in a row, Ashley woke up in a hospital minutes from death. Beside her was a suicide confession signed with her name. But she hadn't written it. The real killer was her own mother, who poisoned both husbands for insurance money and tried to frame her daughter. For more chilling true crime twists, visit the channel and watch the full story.
On October 9th, 2010, a little 2-year-old boy named Rowan Griffin was sitting happily in the back seat of his family's car. He was buckled into his car seat, wedged between his 2 older siblings. His father was at the wheel, navigating the familiar country roads. They were all on their way to a big family party, a get-together at Rowan's grandparents' house. It was one of those perfect autumn days, the kind that feels like a special occasion all by itself. The grandparents lived in a town called Richmond, New Hampshire. It's a very rural part of the state, a place where houses are separated by thick stands of trees and long winding driveways. Their home was exactly like that. It was literally nestled in the woods. To even get to the house, you had to turn off the main road and go down a very long gravel driveway that cut through the forest. The house itself was a simple single-story home, but the real attraction was the backyard. Rowan's grandparents had spent years clearing out the trees behind the house, creating this huge open space. It was the perfect spot for family cookouts, for kids to run around, and for everyone to gather. As Rowan's dad turned the car into that long driveway, they could already see that the party was in full swing. Cars were parked all along the gravel path, lining it all the way from the house back out to the street. It was a clear sign that this was going to be a big one. They found a spot to park and made their way up towards the house. And sure enough, when they rounded the corner into the backyard, it was just a sea of people. There were adults chatting in groups, teenagers tossing a football, and dozens of little kids, Rowan's cousins, running and screaming with joy. For a 2-year-old like Rowan, it was paradise. The moment his dad unbuckled him, he and his siblings took off like a shot, disappearing into the crowd of kids to go play. For the next couple of hours, everything was perfect. The kids were having the time of their lives, darting between the adults, playing tag and exploring the edges of the big yard. The grown-ups were catching up, grilling food, and just enjoying the beautiful day. At some point, a few of the adults started to notice Rowan. Later, when they would try to piece everything together, they'd all remember the same detail. They saw Rowan chasing a cat. The grandparents had a friendly little cat that lived on the property, and Rowan was absolutely fascinated by it. He was following it all around the backyard, his little legs pumping as he tried to keep up. A number of adults saw him do this. They saw him giggle as the cat dodged around a picnic table. They saw him chase it towards the edge of the woods that bordered the yard. And a few of them even saw him run right into the woods, following that cat as it disappeared into the trees. But here's the thing about a big party like that. There's a sort of mob mentality that can set in. Every single adult who saw Rowan run towards the woods thought the exact same thing. They thought, someone else is watching him. His dad is here. His mom is here. There are so many aunts and uncles and grandparents around. Surely someone has an eye on him. They weren't trying to be negligent or careless. It was just a simple and dangerous assumption. In a crowd that large, everyone assumes someone else is responsible. They figured, what could possibly go wrong? He's just a few feet away chasing a cat. He'll be back in a second. A little while later, Rowan's father, Mr. Griffin, was looking around for his youngest son. He scanned the yard, expecting to see his little boy playing with the other kids, but he couldn't spot him. He didn't panic at first. In a yard full of people, it was easy to lose sight of a small child for a moment. He walked over to the group of older kids and asked them casually, "Hey, have you seen Rowan?" And they all said something similar. "Oh yeah, I think I saw him chasing the cat. I think he was over there by the trees." So Mr. Griffin walked over to where they were pointing. He looked around, but still no Rowan. He started asking some of the other adults, "Have you seen my son, Rowan?" And he got the same answer, over and over. "Yeah, he was chasing the cat." I think he ran over in that direction. After a few more minutes of this, after looking around the entire yard and getting the same vague story from everyone, a cold feeling started to creep into Mr. Griffin's stomach. Everyone had seen him, but no one had seen him for the last 10 or 15 minutes. No one knew exactly where he was right now. He raised his voice and called out to the whole group. "Hey, everybody, can you just stop for a second? I can't find Rowan. Everyone's telling me he was chasing a cat, but I can't find him anywhere. Can anyone tell me where he went?" The cheerful party atmosphere evaporated in an instant. The music was turned down. The conversation stopped. Suddenly, everyone was looking around, their faces filled with concern. A quick, frantic search began. They checked inside the house, looking under beds and in closets. They checked the garage. They looked in the front yard, at the end of the long driveway. They even started checking inside all the parked cars, just in case he had somehow wandered in and fallen asleep. But he wasn't anywhere. He wasn't in the house, he wasn't in the yard, he wasn't in any of the cars. He was just gone. The group of family and friends started fanning out, yelling his name. "Rowan! Rowan!" Their voices echoed through the trees that surrounded the property. They ran into the woods, the same woods that several people had seen him run into just a short time before. They pushed through the underbrush, looking behind every tree and under every bush. But there was no sign of him. Mr. Griffin looked at his watch, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to think back. How long had it been since he had last seen his son with his own two eyes? He couldn't be sure. 10 minutes? 20? An hour? He had no idea how long Rowan had been gone for. He wasn't taking any more chances. He pulled out his phone and he called 911. The police arrived quickly. They understood the urgency of the situation. A 2-year-old lost in the woods with nightfall approaching. It was a worst-case scenario. They immediately launched a massive search operation. Officers on foot started creating organized search lines, sweeping through the forest methodically, but this was rural New Hampshire. The community was tight-knit. As word spread about the missing boy, locals started showing up to help. People who lived in the area and owned ATVs and four-wheelers brought them out. They started driving the trails and old logging roads that crisscrossed the vast forest, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Soon, there were hundreds of people out there, police officers, family members, friends, and complete strangers, all united by one goal: to find Rowan. They were all yelling his name, their voices overlapping in a desperate chorus that filled the woods. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows through the trees, they still hadn't found him. They hadn't found a single clue. No footprint, no piece of clothing, no sign at all of where he might have gone. The running theory was that he had simply gotten lost in the forest. After all, the last confirmed sighting of him was chasing that cat into the trees. It made sense. But they had searched the immediate area so thoroughly, it was hard to believe they hadn't found him if he was close by. They just didn't know. Finally, the sun went down completely. The woods became pitch black, and the temperature started to drop. The search commanders made the difficult but necessary decision to postpone the search. It was too dangerous to have hundreds of people wandering around in the dark in such rugged terrain. They would resume at first light the next morning. You can only imagine how horrible that night was for Rowan's parents. They were sitting inside the grandparents' house, the same house that had been filled with so much joy just hours earlier. Now it was such a silent and tense, filled with an unbearable sense of dread. They were forced to just sit and wait, wondering what was happening to their 2-year-old son who was all alone somewhere out in the cold, dark woods. Very early the next morning, long before the sun had even fully risen, a huge crowd of volunteers gathered again at the grandparents' house. They were determined to find Rowan. The search commanders broke them up into groups, assigning each group a specific area of the forest to search. There was one particular group of volunteers that had an idea. They wanted to look a little bit farther away than where most of the search efforts had been focused the day before. The main search was concentrated on the area immediately surrounding the house. This group wanted to go about 3 miles away to a large, swampy area they knew was out there. It seemed like a long shot. It was hard to imagine a 2-year-old could have traveled that far on his own, but they felt they had to check everywhere. So, this small group of searchers set off. They made their way through the dense woods for a couple of hours until they finally reached the edge of the swamp. And they could tell right away that this was going to be incredibly difficult terrain to search. It was a true swamp, wet and deep and treacherous. They were all wearing waders to keep dry, but with every step they took onto what looked like a solid patch of ground, they would sink 2 or 3 feet into the cold, murky water. It was slow, exhausting work, just sludging their way through the thick bog. They pressed on, moving deeper into the swamp. At some point, they made their way through a thick patch of reeds and into a small clearing. And that's when they saw it. Sitting on top of a fallen log on a small patch of dry land, there was what looked like a pair of children's shoes. They looked small, definitely small enough to belong to a child. Their hearts started to beat a little faster. They waded their way over to the log and climbed up onto the dry section of land. They walked over and picked up the shoes. They were definitely kids' shoes. This had to be a sign. They immediately started yelling out for him. "Rowan! Can you hear us, Rowan?" They yelled a few times and then they stopped, holding their breath and listening intently. For a moment, there was only silence. The sound of the wind in the reeds, the buzzing of insects. And then they heard it. A tiny, faint voice calling back to them. From somewhere deeper in the swamp, they heard him yell, "Here! They followed the sound of his voice, pushing their way past a huge, thick bush. And when they looked through the branches, they saw something they could not believe. In the middle of a wide open bog of water, there was a tiny little island, and on that island, there was a single tree. And clutching onto that tree was Rowan. He was just standing there on this little patch of land, holding on to the tree trunk. From where they were standing, he looked perfectly fine. He looked dry. He looked okay. He was just standing on this island in the middle of a deep swamp, completely surrounded by water. Immediately, the searchers didn't hesitate. They jumped right back into the water and started wading their way out towards the island where Rowan was. The whole time they were moving towards him, the water was coming up to their chests. They were looking around, trying to gauge the depth. It was at least this deep all the way around the little island. It was a significant body of water. And as they got closer, they looked up at Rowan and they confirmed what they had seen from a distance. The little boy was bone dry. His clothes weren't wet. His hair wasn't wet. He was a 2-year-old. They had no idea if he knew how to swim or not, but it seemed highly unlikely. And so, as they were sludging through this chest-deep water, they were all thinking the exact same thing. How in the world did he get out here? But in that moment, none of that mattered. Their only thought was, let's just get this kid and bring him back to his parents. They finally reached the edge of the island and pulled themselves up onto the dry land. They gave Rowan a quick look over. He seemed completely unharmed, just a little scared. One of the searchers gently picked him up, making sure to keep him out of the water, and they carried him all the way back. They navigated their way out of the treacherous swamp, back through the woods, and all the way back to his parents. Initially, when they brought Rowan back, everyone was just so overcome with happiness and relief that he was alive. His parents, the police, the hundreds of volunteers, they were all just celebrating the fact that he was safe. No one was asking any tough questions. No one was pressing the issue of what happened, or how he was found on that island, or how he got out there in the first place. They were just leaving it alone. They were just so incredibly happy to have him back. But after the initial wave of emotion had passed, after the dust had settled, Rowan's parents started to gently ask him some questions. They would sit with him and say, what happened out there? How did you get lost? And how did you get onto that little island? At first, Rowan wouldn't say anything. He was only 2, and he had clearly been through a major ordeal. But eventually, he did start to talk about it a little bit. He said that there were cows out there, in the woods. He said that he was very scared of the cows. And he said that he went to the island because he wanted to get away from the cows. Now, this was a very strange thing for him to say. The police and the searchers knew for a fact that there were no cows in that swamp. There were no farms for miles around. There was no livestock anywhere near where he was found that night. So, this left 2 possibilities. Either he was so scared and disoriented that he was hallucinating, seeing animals that weren't there at all, or he was seeing something else, something real, and his 2-year-old brain was simply mislabeling it as cows. Whatever it was that he saw, or believed he saw, it had clearly scared the heck out of him. Whenever his parents would bring up the cows, he would get very frightened and agitated. But, regardless of what he saw or didn't see, the million-dollar question remained. How did he get out to that island? It was a physical impossibility. For a 2-year-old boy, as small as he was, to get to that island, he would have had to swim. The water was simply too deep for him to walk through. It was chest deep on a full-grown man. And everyone knew that Rowan did not know how to swim. But even if you entertain the idea that he had somehow magically found a way to swim across that deep water, there was still a huge, unexplainable problem. Why wasn't he wet? The searchers who found him were adamant. He was bone dry. It's also worth noting that this entire strange event took place just a few miles away from a place known as the infamous Bennington Triangle. This is an area in southern Vermont, right near the New Hampshire border, where there has been a whole string of very strange and mysterious disappearances over the years, many of which have never been solved. Back in 1953, there was an 11-year-old boy named Jerry Monkman. Jerry was, by all accounts, considered a very frail child for his age. He was much skinnier than the other boys in his class, and he was shorter than most of his peers. On top of that, he had a really bad case of asthma. This was a breathing condition that made doing anything remotely physical very difficult and sometimes even dangerous for him. But despite his perceived fragility and his health issues, Jerry absolutely loved being outside. He loved hiking, he loved camping, and he was a very proud member of the Boy Scouts. So, on April 25th of that year, Jerry was incredibly excited. He found out that his Boy Scout troop was offering a special trip. They were going to the Rocky Mountain foothills to go camping and hiking for an entire weekend. For a boy who loved the outdoors as much as Jerry did, this was a dream come true, and he jumped at the opportunity to go. A few days later, Jerry, his entire troop, and their troop leaders all piled into a van, and they made their way up into the majestic Rocky Mountains. As soon as they got there and set up their camp, they headed out on a wickedly rugged hike up into a place called the Teton Canyon. They had been hiking for about an hour, making their way up the steep trail, when one of the troop leaders, who was at the back of the line, happened to turn around to do a head count. And that's when he realized Jerry was gone. The leaders had no idea how long he had been missing for. Had he just wandered off the trail a minute ago? Or had he been gone for 20 minutes? They didn't know. They quickly searched the immediate area for a couple of minutes, calling his name, but there was no response. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, one of the leaders didn't hesitate. He ran back down the mountain as fast as he could to try to get help. Soon, the sheriff's department arrived on the scene. And as news of the missing Boy Scouts spread through the nearby towns, an incredible thing happened. 1,600 volunteers from the local community poured out onto the mountain. They came from all over, ordinary people who just wanted to help find this little boy. They formed massive search lines and began combing across the mountain, determined to find Jerry as quickly as possible. But after several hours of intensive searching, they couldn't find a single trace of him. As the day wore on, people started to think the worst. And then, just as hope was starting to fade, there was a breakthrough. The search party had brought out a bloodhound, a dog specially trained to track human scent. The handler gave the dog an article of Jerry's clothing to get a scent, and the dog immediately picked it up. It started barking and straining at its leash, and then it took off, pulling the handler up the trail. The handler of the dog was ecstatic. He yelled out to everyone, "Hey, he's picked him up! We're gonna find him. We're gonna find him." He thought the dog was going to lead them to Jerry within a mile or so of where they were. He figured the boy had probably just wandered off the path and was sitting under a tree somewhere nearby. But the dog didn't lead them to a nearby spot. The dog just stayed on a complete beeline, heading straight north, deeper and deeper into the wilderness. It didn't waver, it didn't circle back. It just kept going with incredible determination for 6 straight hours. It tracked straight north, hour after hour, until it finally came to a stop at the edge of a big, dark swamp. The dog looked up at its handler as if to say, "I found it." This is where the trail ends. This swamp was 12 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. The handler and the small group of searchers who had managed to keep up with the dog were completely baffled. They looked at the swamp, and then they looked back in the direction they had come from. They thought about Jerry, this frail 11-year-old boy with severe asthma. It seemed totally, utterly improbable that he could have maneuvered 12 miles uphill through some of the most rugged and difficult terrain in the area, all the way to this remote swamp. It just didn't seem physically possible. But they still felt like they had to search it. The dog had led them here, after all. So they spent the next hour carefully searching the entire swamp. But there was nothing there. no sign of Jerry at all. The dog handler was convinced his dog must have made a mistake. Maybe it had picked up the wrong scent, or maybe the trail had gone cold. So he tried to give the scent to the dog again, thinking that this time the dog would turn around and start heading back towards the area where Jerry had originally gone missing. But instead, his dog did something strange. It just sniffed the air, looked around, and then sat down right where it was, essentially reconfirming that, nope, this is where the scent brought me. I'm still right. The dog was certain this was the end of the trail. The dog handler and the exhausted searchers who had made this long, treacherous 12-mile journey up to the swamp, they just couldn't accept it. They decided that the dog must have made a mistake. The kid could never have been here. It was a physical impossibility. So they turned around and began the long walk back, feeling defeated. The next morning, at around 8 o'clock, a completely different story was unfolding about 30 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. An 8-year-old boy named David was out riding his horse. He was just enjoying a quiet morning ride when he happened to look over at the tree line that bordered the field he was in. And just then, a boy stumbled out of the trees. The boy looked tired and disoriented, but he waved to David. So David rode his horse over to see who it was. And it turned out it was Jerry Monkman. Jerry just told David that he needed to get back to his group. David, being a curious 8-year-old, asked him, what are you doing all the way out here? And Jerry's answer was simple and strange. He just said, I don't really know. I need to get back to my group. I was with a group yesterday, and I need to get back to them. Apparently, David then asked him the logical follow-up question. Well, how did you get here if you were with them yesterday? And all Jerry could say was, I fell asleep under a tree. I don't know. When word got back to the massive search party that they had found Jerry and that they had found him 30 miles away, they were in a state of absolute disbelief. The day before, it had been considered completely unbelievable that he could have possibly traveled 12 miles to that swamp. The searchers had literally dismissed the bloodhound's findings because they thought it was so impossible. No way, they said. He couldn't have done it. And now they were being told that he had clearly traveled at least 30 miles to have been found by David where he was. And that's 30 miles as the crow flies. That's a straight line on a map. The reality is, when you're walking through the wilderness, you don't walk in straight lines. You have to make turns, you go left and right to get around obstacles, you follow switchbacks up and down hills, and the area he must have traveled through over those 30 miles is all unmarked wilderness. It's this rugged, hilly, awful, unmarked terrain. So, for him to cover 30 miles in a straight line, he almost for sure had to have covered 40, maybe even 50 plus miles on foot to get there. So, the police asked him. They sat down with him and they said, Jerry, how did you do this? How did you cover the incredible distance you covered in such a short amount of time? And Jerry would just tell them the same thing he told David. He said he just remembers sleeping under a tree. And then he would wake up and he would see animals. He said they were poking their heads around from behind different trees. He didn't know what kind of animals they were, but they were watching him. And he was worried that they were going to hurt him, but they never did. He said he was able to just keep walking, and he would keep sleeping under these trees, and he kept seeing these strange animals that were just watching him from a distance. And he just kept repeating, they never hurt me. They never hurt me. Obviously, this did not answer any of the questions that the investigators were desperate to have answered. They just felt like, okay, maybe he's in shock. We can try to ask him again at another time. But as time went on, his story never changed. And so the prevailing theory among some became, well, then he must have been abducted. That's the only way he could have covered this kind of distance. But that just begs an even bigger question. Who is capable of moving an 11-year-old boy that much distance through that kind of terrain in such a short amount of time? We're talking about a 30-hour window moving potentially 50 plus miles, lugging an 11-year-old around through the Rocky Mountains. And even if there was someone or something that was capable of lifting up an 11-year-old and maneuvering them that much distance in such a short amount of time, the question is, to what end? Why would they do that? Why was Jerry then maneuvered all the way to that swamp where the bloodhound lost his trail and then maneuvered even farther to the spot where he was eventually found? It doesn't make any sense at all. One of the most remote and isolated places in the entire world is an island called Bull Deer Island in Alaska. It's located about 2/3 of the way to Russia along the Aleutian chain of islands. The nearest inhabited island is about 50 miles away across a stretch of brutally cold and dangerous ocean. The weather on Boulder Island is pretty brutal, especially during the long, dark winters. And back in the 1940s, there was no electricity there, no running water, nothing. In 1944, during the height of World War II, the United States Army decided they wanted to send a small team of 5 of their soldiers to monitor the weather station on Bull Deer Island. That was basically the one and only thing the island was used for. One of the people that was selected for this very unique assignment was a guy by the name of Bud Houston. Bud was originally from Wisconsin. He had worked in a shipyard before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was a big hunter and a skilled outdoorsman, and so the prospect of living on this kind of desolate, wild Alaskan island really appealed to him. He was actually excited about the assignment. In October of that year, Bud was flown out to Bull Deer Island, and he met with the other 4 soldiers who were going to be living on the island with him for the foreseeable future. It was going to be just those 5 men on the entire island. There was no one else there. They quickly learned that their primary job, monitoring the weather station, was a very low-effort task. They could get all of their required duties done over the course of the day pretty easily, and this freed up a lot of time for them to explore the island. And that would actually become their favorite pastime because there really wasn't much else to do there except explore the island. So very quickly, the 5 of them became extremely familiar with the whole place. It wasn't that big of an island after all. It was maybe 2.5 miles wide by 4.5 miles long. On March 3rd, 1945, about 5 months after they had first arrived on Bull Deer Island, the men were complete experts on their tiny remote home. By now, they knew every square inch of the island. They were very comfortable there. On that particular day, they had to do a routine patrol around the weather station. This was something they did multiple times a week, so it was very routine, nothing out of the ordinary. All 5 of them were sitting inside the weather station, and Bud said that he would do it. So Bud grabbed his rifle, and he headed outside to do this simple patrol. The other 4 soldiers just stayed inside the weather station, probably playing cards or reading. After about an hour had passed, they realized that Bud hadn't come back yet. This was a little strange. The patrol he was supposed to do does not take more than 20 minutes, max. So they stepped outside to see if he was out there. The weather at the time was very mild for an Alaskan island. There was no snow on the ground, it wasn't very cold, and it wasn't very windy. The visibility that night was actually pretty good. So they're looking out over the island, and it's important to remember that Bull Deer Island has no trees. At the very far end of the island, on the opposite side from where the weather station was located, there is one significant-sized mountain. But short of that, it's not a particularly mountainous island. It's mostly rolling, grassy tundra. So, from their perspective at the weather station, they could look out over the island and basically see everything. And they didn't see him anywhere. At first, they were not that worried about it. They figured, you know what? It's Bud. He knows what he's doing. He's been here for so long, he's probably just out exploring or something. But they decided they should probably go look for him just in case. They went down to the water, to the shoreline, but he wasn't down there. They walked all around the far side of the island calling his name, but they couldn't find him. By the time they got back to the weather station, a real sense of worry had set in. they decided they had to tell their command that they had lost him. So they got on the radio and they called back to their higher command. They said, "We don't know where he went. He went out on a routine patrol, we didn't hear anything, and now he's gone." A whole bunch of reinforcements were sent out to the island to help with the search. They came out on boats and were dropped off to look on foot with the other 4 soldiers. There were also planes and helicopters brought in to do aerial searches. For 2 full days, they looked all over that tiny island for Bud. They scoured every inch of it, and they couldn't find him. And you have to remember, there are very few places you could possibly even go on that island where they wouldn't be able to look and see you. It's small and it's wide open. So, after 2 days of finding absolutely nothing, everyone started to think the same thing. He must have jumped into the water, or maybe he slipped and fell into the water. It was the only logical conclusion. There was simply nowhere for him to hide on the island itself. And so, after a couple of days, the commanders were so sure that it was just not possible for him to still be on the island that they called the search off. They officially declared that he must have fallen into the water and been swept out to sea. Fast forward 40 years to 1988. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was conducting a study on the bird populations on Bull Deer Island. And while they were there, they made an absolutely amazing discovery. This crew of researchers had set up their base camp at about 1,600 feet of elevation, high up on the one large mountain that was on the far side of the island. They were basically on the complete opposite end of the island from where the old weather station had been. One of the crew members happened to be walking around one of the large boulders near their camp, and as he walked past it, he looked down. And he saw this little tiny crevice between the boulder and the ground. He thought he saw something glinting inside of it. So he got down on his hands and knees and he peered into the dark opening, and he realized to his shock that there was a human skeleton that had been kind of crammed into this tiny, tight space. The skeleton still had the tattered remains of a military uniform on it. The uniform had been kind of balled up, but it was definitely a uniform on what was left of the skeleton. And there was also a rifle that had been jammed down in there as well. It would later be identified, and it would turn out to be the remains of Bud Houston. So, this discovery raised a whole host of new, impossible questions. First of all, why did Bud say he was going to go outside and do a simple patrol, which really just meant walking around the immediate vicinity of the weather station? You're certainly not traveling very far. Why did he say he was going to do that? And then proceed to walk 4.5 miles to the other end of the island and then climb up 1,600 feet to the top of this mountain? It makes no sense. But even if he had some secret unknown reason to be over there, a much bigger question is, why would he then force himself into this little tiny crevice? If he was looking for shelter from the elements, well, the weather that night was incredibly mild. It would not have been life-threatening to be out in the elements, at least not that first night or even the second night of the search. And besides, he knew the island like the back of his hand. He probably could have found a much better place for shelter than this awful little crevice. But if he was at a point where he was seeking shelter under these boulders, instead of just walking back to the weather station and getting real warm shelter, then he had to have been in some kind of emergency situation. That's the only way that makes any sense. But if he was in an emergency situation, he would know that his responsibility as a soldier is not just to survive, it's also to be found again. You need to make sure you're not obscured underneath a boulder so that no one can find you. This island, it was like the easiest place in the world to be found. There are no trees. There were helicopters and planes flying directly overhead. And there were all these people on foot searching for him in a very small space. All he had to do was not be hidden under a boulder. Maybe during the day, when the weather let up, he could have rolled out from under the boulder and let himself be found. But that's not what happened. What probably happened is that Bud somehow got crammed into that little tiny crevice almost immediately after he left the weather station to do that patrol. But logically speaking, he would not do that to himself. It doesn't make sense from a survival perspective. So, if he didn't do it to himself, then someone else had to have done it. But all the other people on the island, the only 4 other human beings for 50 miles, were all inside the weather station together at the time this would have been happening. They had a solid alibi. So it really makes you wonder, what happened when he walked outside of that weather station? Who or what did he see? And what did they do to him? Unfortunately, after all these years, we'll probably never know the answer. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.